Okay, it's just gone 4 o'clock. Thanks very much that I'm joined here by my co-host, Jacoby and Vidansky. How are you guys doing? We'll just make sure everybody's audio is connecting.
I'm good, thank you, Michael. How are you?
Great, thanks. How are you, Vidansky?
Good, mate. How you going?
Good. I'm glad you're able to join us. It's not often we get our Australian friends able to join us at this time, so glad you could help us out. And just to make sure, later on, our featured guest will be having a discussion with is Stephen. Stephen, how are you doing? Stephen may be away from the mic at the moment. In case you are there and you would like to speak, you just have to unmute in the bottom left corner. But he may be away because we had told him we wouldn't get started for about 10, so that's okay. Hopefully we'll bring him in a moment. So thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. Ours is a space where I'm trying to bring together people who are interested in open source intelligence, both for those who consume the news to get a little bit better sense of understanding what's real, in terms of what comes across your feed. Some of that is building up some skill as an individual, even if you're not sort of an OSINT practitioner in terms of double checking and sourcing and so on. If you are a little bit more engaged or already doing this kind of work, I'm hoping to bring people together in a way so that they can be sharing their latest and most interesting work. And hopefully people will be, introducing new tools, everybody can bring their skills up, and perhaps meeting new people to collaborate. So that's the goal of the space. I rely pretty heavily on the nest, which is the area at the top of the Spaces screen where I'll be putting in links. If you scroll all the way to the right-hand side, there is a tweet there that I call my agenda, and if you click on it, the thread below it includes links to tons of material that we'll be discussing today. Our conversation topics after our interview with Stephen include some of the details in connection with Putin having been charged with war crimes, then hopefully get into a discussion about the Chinese influence on the war in advance of the meeting between Xi and Putin this week. And if we have time, we might get to the topic of Russian uranium politics that we have been deferring for a session or two just because our conversations have been so interesting, we haven't gotten around to it. I often like to just introduce some resources quickly. One thing I'll highlight is that I just left a conversation being held by my friends. They run a channel called Tochny, and they do analysis dedicated solely to the war in Ukraine. So we differ from them a little bit in that we're happy to look at different regions, look at tools that assist OSINT, and not just sort of the results on the ground or the news out of the war, even though we touch on that a fair bit. Their spaces are often very interesting, and there is a link in the nest to their current space, which I think may be just wrapping up now. I just left them. Once it closes, of course, the recording will be there if you'd like to check it out later. One of our resources is a community calendar that's spearheaded by Jacoby, my co-host. I'm wondering, Jacoby, could you just take maybe a minute to explain the concept behind that?
Sure. We put together a community calendar because in one instance, it's really hard to find Twitter spaces sometimes. And so we wanted a resource for ourselves, us being just people who frequent spaces and are interested in similar topics, including Ukraine and open source resources. And so we wanted to create a resource for ourselves and realized that it was a beneficial thing to also make it available to people other than ourselves. And so that's what we've put together. It's linked in the nest. I think it's the third link in, and I would encourage you not to be surprised at a number of the items there, just that there might be a lot of items there. it's just to identify all the really interesting spaces we think people might like, or that we might like, as well as some exterior events. And you'll see there's either blue or green items there, and the blue items, those represent spaces on Twitter. The green items that are on that calendar represent events or dates of interest that are outside of this type of social media platform. We all invite you to peruse that calendar and use it to your benefit if you think it might be useful to you. You can hover over any one of the links there. Once you go to the actual team up link that's in Michael's post, that's again third from the beginning. And when you arrive at that link, you can interact with any of the entries there. And find perhaps things that you might like to do. For example, there's an event at the Atlantic Council on the 22nd of March, which is Wednesday. It's a talk with Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, who is the popularly voted in president of Belarus, but she lives in exile. She'll be speaking with the Atlantic Council, and it's an online event, and there's a way to register through that link if you wish. And there's a number of other items there that you're welcome to take a look at. And if you have any events that you think we should put on there, please do feel free to DM me or Michael or Vinaki. We'd be happy to take a look at that and possibly add it.
Thanks very much, Jacoby. We really are trying to make it a collective thing, so shoot us whatever events or conversations you think would be worth adding there. Related to that idea is there are often some good podcasts each week, and so there is a tweet up in the nest that collects them together. I'll just highlight that they include a podcast put together by the Crisis Group on the politics of Iran. I learned this week that I believe it's Michael McFall, who is heavily involved in the Russian sanctions group and does good work. He does a podcast apparently based on Substack, so you can check it out at the link in that tweet. There was an interesting conversation with Ian Bremmer about the potential for pushback in American politics on continued support for Ukraine. A conversation between John Spencer, who is an expert in urban warfare, who's a regular in our spaces, and he was interviewing Michael Kaufman, probably the foremost expert on Russian military matters, and who is a guest on many podcasts. So you get another opportunity to hear his thoughts. There was a talk put on that was about the use of private capital in national security business. So that's not specific to Ukraine, but it's the type of thing I suspect it might be interesting to many of the listeners here. And then finally, Jane's, the well-known intelligence company, also does a podcast that it calls Next Level OSINT, and it dives into the implications of technology, culture, ethics, and more that are relevant to people who are OSINT practitioners. So do check that out. Up in the nest as well, I like to put up a Ukraine overview where I highlight the work of a few of the expert mappers here on Twitter. And I put a few of them up just because sometimes there are differences of opinion, so that way you can compare. Of course, Andrew Perpetua was a guest on our show a week and a half ago. Really nice guy, has lots of good contacts on the ground. So check out his maps, and he also streams a live presentation of his maps on Twitch in case you're on that platform as well. I'll highlight that in addition to the general overview of the situation in Ukraine, I also noted a little bit of risk developing around Avdiivka, and so keep an eye on that since most of the focus has been on Bakhmut. As one final note before we go on and start our discussion with Stephen is that friends of this channel have been kind enough to offer to live stream it, and they've convinced me to put a camera up in front of myself just for a different experience. So a lot of the content from the tweets I put in the nest, they turn into graphics and we'll put up on screen. If after the fact you may prefer to listen on Twitter, but you might want to come back and hear it again, you can always check out the YouTube link that is the first item in the nest at the moment. And so I see that we have Stephen with us, and hopefully we're all set to have our conversation. How are you, Stephen? So we may have a little bit of a delay in getting Stephen connected. While we're working out how that's going for him, I'll just shift over to do some updates on some of the matters that we've discussed in past spaces for perhaps 5 minutes, and then hopefully we'll start our conversation with Stephen. So I'll be adding a few items to the nest. One topic that I wanted to provide an update on is sort of the fallout from the downing of the U.S. drone, because there are little nuances that that some really smart people have brought up that I may go otherwise overlooked. So I'm just going to highlight them to you. So I've added 3 items to the nest on that topic. The first of which, on the far left side of the nest, is noting that the Russians, so they actually went ahead and awarded the pilots who were involved in the collision with the U.S. drone, which caused a lot of frustration and consternation. But beyond the award, they were also emphasizing the idea that it was justified because the U.S. drone was flying in an area that they had issued a NOTAM for. And my understanding is that they've issued almost a semi-permanent NOTAM that's covers a wide area of the coastline along the Black Sea off Crimea. Now, a NOTAM, my understanding of them is that it doesn't close the airspace. It's not a no-fly zone. But they're almost treating it in that way, as if the U.S. presence there means it was justifiable for them to interfere with the drone, sort of to push it out. And in discussing this briefly on Thursday night, I also noted how it's believed that China will be paying close attention to the way the United States responds to this issue, since the Chinese also, they have established air defense identification zones, and they assert control over areas of the South China Sea that are not recognized in international law. And so how the U.S. responds will be interesting. And hopefully it doesn't establish any kind of a precedent whereby NOTAMs take on more weight than they're actually afforded. In connection with that, the second item in the nest, also about the downing of the U.S. drone, is a historical example. It was a tweet by Samuel Chirap. I believe he's with RAND. And I know that he has been criticized a little bit for taking positions that aren't particularly positive regarding the Ukrainian position. But the historical point he raises is interesting nonetheless, which is that there have been past cases involving shipping where there were actually incidents of ramming, where a Soviet ship rammed into a U.S. ship. And he makes the point that just because an incident like this has occurred, it can sometimes be used as an opportunity to clarify operational intention. Of course, that requires, potentially more of a goodwill back and forth than exists between Russia and Ukraine at the moment. But it is an interesting example. And he noted that as a result of that, what actually happened, so it's down thread in his tweet, but is that the Russians confirmed their acceptance of international sea lanes, but at the same time, the United States indicated in a bit of a quid pro quo that they didn't see a need to continue monitoring or sending ships along that specific route. And so I know that some of the aircraft observers have been looking closely to see whether the U.S. would send drones back on a similar route over the Black Sea through that NOTAM area, where the downed drone had its, it was collided with by the Russian jet. And it was noted that I believe an RQ-4 did make a pass or two on that same path near to the Crimean coastline, but that it was only a handful of passes, and it may have been intended for symbolic value, and then it sort of took up station over Moldova. But for those who follow the aircraft tracks, I would be curious if you can maybe later on you can come up and let us know if you've seen the U.S. just resuming the track entirely. Last point in connection with the downing of the drone, it's a post in the Nest by Christina Maza, who notes that there has been an effort in the U.S. Congress to pass a law that would require the State Department, Defense Department to develop a Black Sea strategy. And apparently that's been an initiative that's been pushed along in the background for several years. And this may be a flashpoint that finally puts that bill over the edge and require a strategy to be developed. So if you're interested in the space, watch for that to develop further. Okay, so hopefully we're all connected now. Stephen, can you hear us? Can you unmute and join us?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you.
Excellent, thank you very much. I'm glad we got that all worked out.
Yeah.
Stephen is a translator who is living in the European Union, but he has family ties both to, I understand it's Ukraine and Belarus, and that he also has some contacts in Russia. And he's been a regular contributor now for several months to the project War Translated, which, I'm sure almost everybody listening will have come across their posts. They're very valuable. And so we appreciate the project's work, and I've been following Stephen's in particular for months now. So Stephen, I was curious, I think I may have seen and retweeted your very first viral translation. If I am not mistaken, one that went really viral early on was an interview with a Ukrainian tank commander who was breaking down the needs of the Ukrainians. What inspired you to translate that particular piece?
So I have a whole story related to that, I suppose. Well, I've always been interested in history, and in particular, I really enjoyed the videos of this channel called Military History Visualized. He always did videos relating to World War II. And what I noticed about when I was watching these videos is I learned to know what sort of source is very valuable to historians. I'm just getting a message that my audio is a bit choppy. Is it fine on your end?
It's a tiny bit choppy, but I know that you're using an emulator because we had to get around the Android bug.
Yeah.
So other than maybe just moving back from your microphone a couple of inches just to bring your volume down, I think we'll run with it as it is.
Right. So from watching these historical videos, I kind of learned to recognize what would be a valuable source. And during the summer, when I was reading, it was actually a video of a Ukrainian. I don't think it was a tank commander. It was a lieutenant in the army, I believe. And I just realized that these points would be very valuable to a historian, and by extension, I realized the Twitter community. So I summarized this in a few points, and I just posted it. I didn't think much of it. I just thought it would be used as a source by some obscure history channel, but it ended up actually going quite viral. And Military History Visualized, who was my original inspiration to make the video, so to speak, actually ended up finding it and using it as a source for one of his videos. So that was quite ironic. But yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that part about. I didn't know that he had actually used your video, which is kind of a real coup for you. So I've just been chatting in the background with my co-hosts, and it's been suggested that, since we are hoping to speak with you for a little while, would you be open, Stephen, to just exiting the space and cycling back up? It will take, 20 or 30 seconds, and that might resolve some of your microphone problems. If it doesn't, then we'll just roll with what we have. But if you don't mind, you can leave, come back up. We'll add you as a speaker and resume in just a moment. Okay, thank you. Okay, guys, this is the nature of live audio. We had there, for those who don't know, there is a bug in Spaces that is affecting Android users, so that if they're running the most recent version of Twitter, they can listen to Spaces, but they can't actually, they can join as a speaker, but they can't actually speak. And to get around that, you have to roll back. You have to roll back your version to an earlier version and or use an emulator, and that's how we've helped Stephen get around the issue, is by using an emulator. So hopefully that's smoothed out your audio a little bit. How are you doing?
Is this any better or still bad?
It's actually much better. Right. So thank you for doing that. So that's great that the History Visualized channel used your translation. Has that ever happened again? Have any more of your translations been used by that channel in their videos?
Not that channel in particular, but I did. My translation work was used in a Forbes article on the Battle of Volnovakha in the beginning of the war. It was also a tanker's translation. I translated an interview of a Ukrainian, I believe it was a platoon commander in the 53rd Mechanized Brigade, if memory serves me correctly. And that interview got used as part of a Forbes article. But other than that, I can't really think of any specific examples now.
Well, it's always nice to get recognition of your work. Obviously, by being featured on War Translated, you're getting potentially an even broader reach than Forbes in some cases. And it's also great that your first translation, you stepped up to the plate and essentially hit a home run on a very interesting article. It's always cool to hear how people are inspired, and the fact that you took inspiration from somebody on social media, and now you're contributing to the conversation is a great story. And so, just so you can let us know, what languages do you know?
So obviously I'm fluent in English, I'm fluent in Russian, but I understand spoken Ukrainian because spoken Ukrainian is quite close to Russian, but I can't actually speak Ukrainian fully. I can understand it, but I can't speak it. I also understand spoken Belarusian as a result of my parents. It's also very similar. And I wouldn't say I fully understand Polish, but I understand it far more than the average person. But I'm also learning German, but that's not really relevant, I suppose.
Well,
and also, one point that you addressed earlier was that I have family in Ukraine. I actually don't. I only have a lot of friends in Ukraine, but I don't actually have direct blood ties to Ukraine.
I see. I misunderstood that. So your family is from Belarus in that case?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a great mix of languages to have to, contribute to the work that you're doing. Just to get a little bit of audience involvement. So personal disclosure, a few months ago, I decided I would be interested in learning Ukrainian. I didn't imagine I would learn it quickly enough that I could, it would contribute to my tracking the news necessarily. I was humble about that, but I've made some progress just using some online apps. And I'm curious, for those in the audience, if anybody has been inspired to learn Ukrainian or another language, in connection with their OSINT work or in connection with the war, if you just flash an emoji symbol, I'd be curious to see if that's sort of a shared experience that people have had. Whether you just throw up a heart or a plus sign. So it may be rarer than I expected, but that's interesting. Okay. It has been interesting. I do see a handful of people who have been inspired, but I had thought it might even be a higher number. In chatting with people who are heavily involved in OSINT, I've actually been impressed at the number who are, not only bilingual, but, speak more than 2 languages at a time. And so when you say that you're working on German and you have sort of a working knowledge of Polish, are you working on any of those to improve it for the purposes of your translation, or you're just learning them for, either work or personal interest?
Well, I'm learning German in school, so I kind of didn't have a choice in that matter, but I found that I was actually very good at it, and I enjoy languages. Both my parents are translators, so I suppose I have a bit of that in my blood.
Well, that's really interesting. I wouldn't have expected, both parents to be translators. And so does that mean, are you, when you say you're learning German in school, are you working toward doing translation, or is it just related to the field that you'll be in?
It's more so just general. It's very good to know a language, but it would be very nice to be able to employ it in translation as well, because obviously that would give me a very broad scope in terms of European affairs if I know a Central European language, a Western European language, and an Eastern European language.
Absolutely, that's a great mix. And so after that first translation of yours went viral and got a lot of attention, did you immediately connect with Dmitry of War Translated, or did you have to stick at it for a little bit of time on your own before connecting with him?
There was actually a gap in between those two events. I did the translation. It obviously got a lot of responses, a lot of which are very, very positive. But I think I translated a few small bits and pieces. For example, you may know Igor Strelkov Girkin, but I think it was about a month after my tank translation that Dmitry actually made a post that requested any translators to help them out with the workload. And I got in contact with them, and that was in, I believe it was mid-August of last year, and I've been translating ever since.
It's a really interesting story to see how people, volunteer their time and connect with a great organization, and then it becomes a bigger structure than maybe anybody had intended. So how many people are there now working with War Translated in a regular way?
So I believe I'm just counting them on my fingers. So me, Dmitry, Ashis, Anastasia, Ashley, who's in the audience, and then there's Vladimir. So 7, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's impressive the way that sort of a volunteer organization can grow like that. I know I followed several of you, including Addis, who I also see in the audience. So at this point, obviously the first few that you translated, you went with Gherkin and, these interesting commentaries from Ukrainian military officers. At this point, where do you find the source articles that you translate? Is there a coordinated distribution system or pool through War Translated, or are you out there looking for interesting items on your own?
So currently we're working on, I suppose, a bit of an ad hoc basis where each of us kind of prowls the internet on our own. We have a group chat where we send in an article that we're looking to translate to make sure that no one's done it before, because there was actually one case where I had worked for about an hour on an article that I found that I thought was very interesting. And then when I sent it to Dmitry, I found out that he had just done it about an hour before. So there's no real structure to it, but we use a group chat to coordinate, and we have a really wide variety of types of material that we translate. We have intercepted phone calls. We have videos. A lot of the mobilized videos have been gaining a lot of traction. So we've videos, we've phone calls, we've just random articles from Russian. A lot of it comes from Telegram. And then we also used to have Arestovich streams, but we're stopping that now in light of the controversies surrounding the main individual, I suppose. Yeah, and each of us each of us kind of has their own domain, so to speak. So Dmitry, he kind of does everything. He spends a lot of his time on the project. Then Ashis also does both audio translations and written ones. And then me, Anastasia, and Volodymyr, we mainly focus on written articles, because adding subtitles is it's actually a skill set, even though it's not that complicated, and you have to have a paid subscription on a website. So that's kind of a limiting factor in terms of translating certain types of media.
Well, that's interesting. That I'd imagine there's a bit of maybe a matrix or an overlay in terms of a variety of skills, which would include how well do you know the relevant language that it's in? Perhaps there might be some subject matter expertise. If it's a discussion about equipment, there might be quite a lot of jargon or military tactics. And then there's the source media, as you were just describing, whether it's written or video. On that subject of subject matter expertise, is that an issue you guys encounter very often, where you're dealing with acronyms and jargon?
Not particularly. We don't really have a separation of who does what, because I find that all of us have been tracking the war basically since day one, and extensively on Twitter, reading all the articles, watching all the videos. So we've kind of involuntarily become very, very familiar with the subject matter. Sometimes it can be a bit difficult where, for example, for me, the content I consume is in English. So, for example, an acronym like SEED, Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses, I don't even know that acronym in Russian, but Google is a great aid there. I just put in the acronym and military meaning, and it kind of helps a lot. So I find that technology in the modern world is really great for reducing barriers of expertise in things like translation.
So I know that you said that each individual may find your own source material to translate. I am curious though, because having followed Dimitri's account for a long time, at some points he'll say, I'm swamped at the moment, or I've been tagged in many videos. I can't catch up for a few days or a week. Don't worry about tagging me for a time. And then at other times he said, if you see this type of material specifically, tag me in it. How much does finding interesting material rely on the contribution of just the audience? Do you find material in that way?
Yeah, the problem with that is that Dmitry is the only one who has access to the Twitter account due to him not being willing to share his password, and I don't think it's for obvious reasons. And I don't think it actually is technically possible to have multiple people share a Twitter account without having issues. So he gets all the audience suggestions, and the rest of us we kind of have to act independently. Where I know for a fact, at least I'm subscribed to literally dozens of Telegram channels where I'm constantly checking if there's a new interesting post. So a lot of it is actually we're kind of like journalists. We don't just have to translate it. We actually have to find the source material, and then there's also a certain quality control where we don't want to be just translating every. I'm sure you've seen the eyes emoji, lightning emoji posts. We want to filter out the total clickbait, so to speak, as well.
Absolutely, and I think that's probably been an important element in the success of War Translated, is the reliability of the material that you guys pick to highlight. And so you referred to regularly refreshing Telegram. Is that primarily where you find your material, or are you searching on other platforms as well?
Primarily, yes, because Telegram is, I would say, the main social network of Eastern Europe for things like this. Instead of Twitter, they have Telegram. So even if, say, Arestovich, he has a YouTube channel, but he still has a Telegram where he posts everything. Every major source has a Telegram account, even if they are present on other platforms. And Telegram, obviously, the anonymity of it as well, also makes it possible to be posting posting videos in an uncensored way, so people don't worry about posting war-related materials. For example, I know on YouTube there's a lot of issues with demonetization. If you post a lot of war-related stuff on Telegram, that's not an issue. So Telegram really is the best platform for war tracking in general. I remember in the Syria conflict, it was also heavily used, I believe, but definitely in any Eastern European conflict, Telegram is the go-to place if you want primary source material.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. I'll take just a moment to reset for anybody who may have joined us that we're just having a discussion with Stephen, who is a regular contributor to War Translated as a translator. I'll be working through a few more questions with Stephen for maybe another 10 or 15 minutes anyway, but I will give everybody a heads up in a few minutes as I wind toward the end of my questions, that at that point we'll be inviting members up from the audience to pose their questions. So if you any questions occur to you, we'd love to have you ask them. I'll let you guys know in a few minutes when it's time to come up. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to encourage everybody to not only follow Stephen, but then also to check out the War Translated channel. And so, Stephen, you know, you describe actively searching a variety of Telegram channels. I know you can't necessarily speak for the group, but have you ever considered, or have you ever had discussions about the risk of becoming overly reliant on, you know, a handful of sources who are, you know, prominent? You mentioned the Arestovich interviews as one item where he was doing his conversations something like 5 or 6 days a week. I'm curious how much you rely on just regular sources versus sort of actively going out and, you know, beating the bushes to find original content.
Well, we try to kind of prowl all corners of Telegram. We try not to rely on, as you said, regular sources, but I suppose it just becomes a habit, so to speak, where you're just used to checking the channel every day. It falls into a routine. But we do try, especially I know that Dmitry, he really tries to go to every obscure pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, whatever source to try find things. And if he doesn't have the time to translate a text, he'll just send us a link to that text, and then whoever wants to can pick it up. But yes, we do try to kind of find obscure sources, because the Arestovich thing really was an issue for us, where he fell off in popularity, so to speak, and we had become so reliant on him, we had to quickly search for other sources and other materials to translate.
Interesting. So I was curious, any given piece that's translated, I presume it's given to somebody who is so fluent that their accuracy is quite high. But do you have within your group any ability to either compare notes if you're unsure of a specific translation that might be you know, jargon-based or technical, or is there any sort of a double check method among the group to improve accuracy?
Certainly, that's actually one of the main uses of the group, because anytime, as you said, someone doesn't know a word, they post it into the group, and anything that Dmitry ends up posting on the main account, that goes through Telegram, and we all have a chance to look through it. And part of it is spelling mistakes, part of it is incorrect context. Everyone makes mistakes, and we all correct each other's mistakes. And in terms of languages, some of us are better at Ukrainian than others, because obviously I know for a fact that Anastasia, one of our translators, she grew up in Ukraine, so she obviously has a better handle on it. So we all understand Ukrainian to a certain degree, but we might not know some obscure words. So yes, we often send it into the group chat, like, what does this word mean? And since there's that many of us, nearly always we'll get an answer.
I know that some of the pieces that you translate are considerably a much more considerable investment of time than others, in that a written piece, would only be several pages long in many cases, but that a video interview could be, several hours long. What do you consider in terms of how long a piece is going to take to translate, and the value of, do you do a segment of it? And so if it's, say, an hour-long conversation on video, how long would that then take you in work to do the translation?
So if you're subtitling a video, I think it's I don't have much experience subtitling, but I think Dmitry said in the group chat the other day that when subtitling, 1 minute of video takes 10 minutes to translate and then write down the subtitles. When you're listening to something and writing it down, for example, the Arestovich broadcasts, I find that it's approximately 1 minute of listening is equal to 3 minutes of writing. As you said, the longer sources such as the Arestovich broadcasts, and we did also what was his name? There was another Ukrainian military expert, I believe, Zhdanov was his name. We summarized it. We left out a lot of the parts that we thought were irrelevant, and we also left out some of the parts that Western audiences may not be interested in. Say, when Arestovich was going on about how his relationship with Mikhailo Podlyak, I don't think a lot of Western audiences would even know who that is and care about it even less. But in terms of the time investment, the most time-intensive one is certainly subtitling it. After that, it would be listening to something and writing it down. And as for translating a written text into written text, that takes around, I suppose, it takes the shortest, but it's usually just taking an average post that Dmitry posts. It's usually about, I don't know, approximately 1 A4 page long in the region of on Telegram. That would usually take about, I would say, 20 minutes to half an hour. So it's not that massive of a time investment. The vast majority of the time goes to subtitling videos.
So I imagine, it's interesting that you say you'll summarize, and so that there's a bit of editorial decision in there as well. But I appreciate the necessity for that, because there's just so much content that there's probably more than even a group that's as big as 7 or more translators. That's more than I'm sure your group can handle. So having to make those editorial decisions is an important part of the process. I've heard it said from people I know who are native Ukrainian speakers. They'll say that the English language information space on Twitter is often a day or 2 days behind many of the more detailed developments, particularly as they relate to the front, just because it takes that long for things to be translated into English. If you had to guess at sort of what the delay is between something being distributed fairly widely in Ukrainian to before it becomes widely available in English, how long do you think that delay might be?
See, it's a very variable thing where it kind of depends on how fast the translator gets to it. So, for example, during an offensive, now I remember, for example, the Kherson offensive, Dmitry was kind of on duty, and so were we. So the second the post popped up, we were on translating it. So then the delay was pretty much minimal. We could get out translation within half an hour of the event being publicized. But it's just in the floods of constant news, it does get lost, a lot of the developments, especially the more so minor ones. I don't know if it's a day. I would say it would be closer to 12 hours. Because usually someone does get on it, especially with the mass proliferation of automatic translators, which may not be the best quality, but they are certainly capable of getting the message across. Like, I've seen even non-Russian speaking accounts be able to get and process that information fairly quickly, thanks to tools such as Google Translate, and for videos, it was, I believe it's called Vid Translator.
Which, is a great segue. I was just about to ask you, do you ever use any automation in your own work, or do you think there is scope to add it in if you had, tools available to you that you just don't at the moment?
So a common technique translators use is that they'll put in the text into Google Translate, and then they'll go through it once it's through Google Translate to fix the issues. I personally don't do that. I don't know. It's just I find it's easier for me to kind of start from scratch. But there is certainly a lot of utility in these automatic translation tools, and they're getting better and better, I would say. They'll never be perfect, but I think you can get by with them. Yeah.
I know that for my own sake, not sort of being a novice at Ukrainian and knowing no Russian, the tools that I tend to rely on include Google Lens, because I'm often trying to translate something, text that's in a picture or in a video that isn't, happily in sort of character recognized form, and Google Lens is handy at that. I discovered a tool fairly recently. It's called Veed.io, Veed.io, and it will generate translated captions from audio from a wide variety of languages. And it's sort of helped me in a pinch when I've suddenly needed audio translation. But I don't know that it's the best tool for it. And likewise, if YouTube has already generated captions, I'll sometimes just use a website. There's one called Downsub, where you can just download the subtitles that YouTube has generated and run that text through a translator, which in my case can speed things up quite a bit.
So about Google Lens, it can be a useful tool, but I found that it's actually it's not, for me, it's not reliable enough, obviously, because I understand it. But secondly, if I was to use something, I would actually recommend trying to transcribe the text into using some sort of Cyrillic keyboard, transcribe the text into the written version of Google Translate and then translate it, because I find that Google Lens can be quite a bit more inaccurate than the written version. In terms of Veed, I've also heard of that one. Automatic captions are a very dodgy thing, so to speak, because a lot of it is based on human kind of intonation. So when a person makes a pause in their speech, the software can interpret that as a full stop, and that creates problems. So I don't have a lot of experience, frankly, but I can understand why people who don't speak the original language, obviously that's their only option.
So those are great points of caution. I guess I should add the caveat that when I am using those tools, it's usually not to generate a translation that I put out, but it's when somebody else has quoted an individual, and often it will be one of these breaking news channels, and they'll say this person said this, and it's usually some unexpected or shocking quote. And I'll go and I'll track down the original video, but often it's within an hour or two of the video or the interview having been given. And so captions and translations have not been generated yet. So I'll use it only for the purposes of an approximate translation, just to see whether it matches the description that sort of is going around virally. So it's Lens and Veed are probably rough and ready only for purposes like that. Jacoby, did you want to join the conversation?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions for Stephen, if we haven't already covered them. One of them was in relation to what we were talking about just now, the auto-translate tools that you use, the companies that you employ in different ways, Google Translate, DeepL, perhaps other ones that you use. I've found that translators have said that the more you use those online or automated tools, the more humans interact with them, the more accurate that they become. And I wonder if you found that to be fairly true, and or if people at War Translated have reached out to these companies or open source entities, if they're not for profits, to work with them to make their tools more accurate, or if they've reached out alternatively to you, to want to work with you because you use it so much day to day.
To my knowledge, we haven't had any interaction. Now, if it were to happen, it would probably go through Dmitry, so I wouldn't be the first to know about it. But in terms of the software becoming better, the more people use it, I think that that's one of the points with the new AI softwares that are going around. OpenAI, I think, has a version where it can actually facilitate translation. And as far as I'm aware, I'm not an expert in the AI field now. The more, as you said, the more people use it, the more it adapts to it. But we haven't, we don't overly rely on these softwares, because obviously we do most of the things we do manually. The only software that we really use is for putting subtitles to the videos, and even then there's not much of an AI interaction there. As I understand, it's mostly manual typing into it. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. I've also heard it not just with the AI kind of machines or programs, but just the libraries of that exist. You know, the language libraries that exist inside Google. I'm sure they have some level of AI, but not like this chat AI or open AI kind of thing. That it just, the more you add vocabulary to it, the more it, you know, there's more nuance to the library of words.
Well, I can testify to that being true, because it's a general trend on Google Translate, for example, where the more speakers a language has, the better the translate function for it is. I believe there's also a certain level of human interaction in that, where Google Translate actually works by, there's workers manually verifying that the translations are correct and then inputting them into the database. How I know this is that in Ireland, we have Irish, and it's quite an obscure language. A lot of people don't even know it exists. So when I have to use Google Translate for that, it's a very poor quality, because the translating and the adaptation pool for it is tiny. But say when I'm translating something for German, it's of much higher quality. And that actually brings up another point, where Google Translate and other software, it works much better when the languages are of the same group. So English and German, they're of the same Germanic group of languages. So the structures, the verbs, even some of the words would be pretty similar. And that really assists the computer when making the translation. But Russian is of a completely separate group as opposed to English. So a lot of the sentence structures, they can really skew the automatic translators. I found, I don't know any Chinese people and or Asian people in general, but I would imagine that translation quality from those Oriental languages would be quite poor compared to what we're used to in European languages.
And I don't want to change the subject off of this, but it was a question that I wanted to reach back to your conversation with Michael about Telegram. I was really curious to know about how you look at the reliability of Telegram accounts that you're using, going back to again and again. And you sort of touched a little bit on it, but how you discern, particularly your understanding of the language certainly helps, but how you discern between the accounts to know which ones, you know, are really unreliable from a language standpoint, as well as just, you know, their telling of events or recounting of information.
Certainly. It's part of it is obviously common sense. We don't publish, we try not to publish anyway, sensationalist posts that you can kind of straight away see if they're sensationalist. But another thing is, it's Telegram has a, similar enough system, I suppose, to Twitter, where a lot of the big accounts, they're cross-posting each other. So, for example, Strelkov, Igor Girkin, he'd often he'd often like repost some post from some other channel and then make certain comments about it. So there's kind of like an ecosystem that's been built up by all the major channels where they're all reposting each other, and if they are, we know that's accurate information. But that brings up another issue, obviously, where I was speaking earlier about trying to find obscure sources where they might not be known yet. That's kind of a very delicate balancing act that we have to do, where not all of the sources are well known, but the ones that are well known, we still have to ensure that they're reliable. And how we do that is, I would say, mostly just common sense, where when there's a Russian, when we read about them posting about how the lads just destroyed 5 Abrams and 2 Bradleys, we can discount that straight away, so to speak.
Discounting it because that information is inherently, it has nothing really to do with translation. It's just false.
It's just false, and like, if a person is willing to post such blatant misinformation, I don't think they can be trusted as a source in general to not misrepresent anything else that they post.
Thanks for that set of questions, Jacoby. So what I think I'm going to do is I have a few more questions for Stephen that are based on his opinions about how things are going, given that he has friends in Ukraine and he has some family in Belarus. So run through some of those opinion impression questions. I do have one or two more questions about the work of the team. What I might do is, since I see some of your colleagues in the audience, I may just send out an invite or two, so that if some of the audience questions might generate more of a roundtable about ways to develop the project or contribute, they might consider joining us. If not, then that's no pressure. And just a reminder to the audience that if you have a question at this point, if you request to speak, I'll bring you up and we'll start putting people into line. And if you're enjoying the space and you'd like to get more people into the conversation, if you were to retweet it, that will help us develop a bigger crowd and hopefully have a more fulsome conversation. So Stephen, you mentioned in some of our initial chatting that you had some actually personal stories from the regions, Chernihiv, Kherson, Mariupol. Were you there in person for a time?
No, I was not in Ukraine.
Oh.
I've never been to Ukraine in person physically. I've only spoken to a lot of people from it. But thankfully, no, I was not in Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict.
So you had suggested to me that you might have some stories related to those regions, though. Are those people you've been in touch with, or?
Yeah, yes, those I may have misinterpreted your I may have kind of falsely called them personal, because they weren't actually my stories. They were personal stories told to me by people who were there.
I understand. Sure. Without much detail, without my having much detail on those, I can't prompt you too much. But would you like to share one or two of them with us that you found particularly interesting?
Sure. So one of the recent ones is that I was speaking to someone who had family in the south in, I believe it was either Zaporizhia or Dnipro. I believe it's Zaporizhia. And they were actually in contact with someone else who was in Russian occupied territory. And they were telling him they were telling me how this person who's in Russian occupied territory, he actually observes S-300 missiles being shot in the direction of the city, and that they can alert the Ukrainian army when there's an airstrike coming in. depending on which direction the missiles go. If the missiles go straight over their house, they know they're headed for the city. So they call up the Ukrainian army and tell them that there's missiles incoming, because the nature of the S-300 is that it's such a quick missile, and the direction and the distance is so small that the Ukrainian radars and air defense don't actually have time to detect it. But if the missile goes off a little bit to the side, they know that they're headed for targets on the front line, and therefore they don't call up the city authorities, and therefore they know not to raise an air alarm, which I found very curious, that there's this type of engagement from average Ukrainian civilians helping with the air raid system.
That is a lot of knowledge on the civilian part. It's great everybody is doing their parts. Do you ever hear them stories of them? I understand there's an app, I think through the DIA app system, where they can report Russian movements as well. Do you ever hear about the people you're in touch with interacting, passing information that way?
I have heard of a person in Kherson Oblast before. It was occupied, obviously, using that sort of infrastructure, I believe, to report on Russian troop positions. And yeah, and right now I have people in the Armansk area who have been monitoring Russian defenses go up all around them. This might be a thing I can touch on later, because there's a bit more detail to this question. But they are there, like they do have the intention of passing on this information to the Ukrainian forces.
You had also told me that because of some family connections, that you have a general sense of the situation in Belarus. And I know there's been a lot of speculation about the potential Belarusian engagement in the war. Given your connections there, what is your sense about the situation there?
My personal assessment is that it is very unlikely that the Belarusian army will enter the war. Firstly, I would recommend for anyone following this conflict, this is a great OSINT tool, to follow Belarusian Hayun project, Hajun. It's an account that basically tracks any and all military activity on the in the territory of Belarus. And I think they recently made a post where they were tracking how many Russian soldiers entered the country and how many left. And I believe it was something like 200 entered and over 1,000 left. So there does not seem to be any sort of buildup. The general consensus among both people on Twitter and people in Belarus is that Belarus is being used as a training ground for Russian troops, because Russian training facilities are simply too full. But I would also say that, knowing the situation in Belarus, it's very tense right now, and I think Lukashenko is smart enough to realize that his position is quite not very resilient, and entering into war would bring him in conflict with the army, who clearly, having seen their Russian comrades go to their death, do not exactly want to sacrifice themselves for Putin's delusions. And currently in Belarus, the army is perhaps the main threat to Lukashenko, because the protest movement that we saw in 2020 and 2021 has basically been exiled, disarmed, imprisoned, and divided. So currently that does not pose much of a threat, but there's certainly a faction in the government there that is very much anti-war, because out of very selfish interests. So, and Lukashenko realizes this, and he's always been known as a person who tries to balance between the West and Russia. So kind of when he's going too far to Russia, he starts making overtures to the European Union. And when Belarus gets too close to the EU, he starts making overtures to Russia. And he realizes that invading Ukraine would be a point of no return. And the argument that I've always made in relation to this matter is that Lukashenko decided not to invade during the first days of the war, back when Russian troops were besieging Kiev and it seemed that it would be over in a few hours. Why would he not invade then, where back then there was certainly a lot of things to gain from the invasion? Why would he send his troops now, risking a military coup, when the Belarusian troops do not have any capacity to actually succeed in getting him anything? It just seems like if the risk was so low back then and he still didn't decide to take it, I highly doubt that he'll take it now. The main argument, I suppose, is if Putin manages to pressure him into doing it. But I would say that Putin does not have much assets left at his disposal to pressure Belarus, and that Belarus is far more useful to him as a neutral meeting ground, so to speak, rather than an active participant in the conflict. Because if you remember, during the first days of the war, there were negotiations to end the conflict. Those were held in Belarus, near the border. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was also signed in Belarus, in the Belaverskaya Pusha. The Minsk agreements in 2015 obviously were also signed in Belarus. So it's just the Belarusian army is about 50,000 in size, I believe. It has a few maneuver brigades, most of which are equipped with conscripts with very outdated equipment, much of which that has been sent away to Russia. So they could not really add much capability to Putin's army, and the capability that they could contribute in terms of spare tanks and spare artillery has already been exploited by Putin, wherein he actually there's an Oryx list for this, where he lists all the equipment that has been exported from Belarus into Russia. So I feel that Putin has reached the limits of usefulness from Belarus, and bringing them into this conflict would only worsen his position. And I think both Putin and Lukashenko realize, which I believe that no matter how evil their actions are, that they're still rational actors, and rational actors would not invade now.
It's nice to hear that somebody with your level of connection to the region is reaching a same analytical point as many of the conversations that we've had in these spaces already. To echo your point, within my thread for this space, one of the sections I have is good examples of OSINT work from the last week, and one of those examples is satellite analysis that was done by the Belarusian Hagen, that's my poor pronunciation, project that also I think goes by the screen name Motalk Help. So I agree that's a great source that I would encourage people to follow for information on Belarus. And I'll also note, even though you had mentioned that the Belarusian opposition has been considerably weakened and is exiled, that in our events section there is a talk with the exiled opposition leader Svetlana, who's speaking with, I think, the Atlantic Council later this week. And so if anybody listening would like to hear more, you can check that section of the thread on the calendar and events. So thanks very much. Go ahead.
The problem with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is that she's a great leader, but there isn't much to lead. The Belarusian opposition, first of all, lacks manpower to do anything. A lot of people were imprisoned. I believe Belarus is one of the highest countries in the world currently in percentage of people imprisoned or under investigation. And secondly, they lack funds, which no one seems eager to provide. And the internal opposition platform is very divided in factions who kind of can't decide what to do. So this might be a bit of a pessimistic viewpoint, but as someone who has a first-hand knowledge of the opposition in Belarus, I would frankly not be expecting much from them in the next few, even years, I suppose.
And I understand that perspective. Hearing her speak may help people who aren't familiar with the region get a better sense of the prospects. And so I'll probably still drop by to listen to her, but I definitely hear what you're saying about it not being a consolidated movement at the moment. Okay, so I know we've been joined by a few people on the stage here who have questions for Stephen. So I'm happy to run through some audience questions. If you're still listening and you'd like to ask a question, just request the mic. It's the button in the bottom left of the screen, and you can come up and we'd love to hear you. So I'll go right to exit then. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Stephen, are there languages that you guys at Word Translated wish you had a translator for that would kind of help you round out what you guys present information-wise?
Currently, not really, because thanks to the consequences of the Soviet Union, Russian is basically a lingua franca in all states of the Soviet Union, where even in, say, Georgia, you could get by speaking Russian, and a lot of source material is in Russian. During the, I don't know if you remember, there's some time back, there were some certain, there was a feeling that the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict would heat up again. So we floated the idea of having people from those territories come in to expand our reach, but we decided against it. We kind of decided to concentrate our focus on the Ukraine-Russia side of things, and as well as obviously Belarus also speaks Russian. So we find that Russian is more than sufficient. We don't really have any languages on our wish list, so to speak.
Would you like to follow up on that? Exit?
I just would love it if you had a Turkish translator. That would help me out a lot. So if you guys happen to find one, by all means, let us know.
All right. Well, we haven't considered the Turkish side of things, but that certainly, I feel like Turkey is playing a very underrated role in this conflict that a lot of people don't realize. And certainly, if things were to go back to the negotiating stage, I know that I mentioned Belarus earlier as a negotiating stage, but I am very confident that Turkey would be very involved in such negotiations. So that is actually something we might look into.
Jacoby, did you want to go ahead?
Sure. I wanted to touch on your own experience crossing back and forth between languages and cultures. And I've spoken to people who have, been engaged in grassroots work with the Orange Revolution and some other revolutionary and engagements in Ukraine and around that area. And I've heard that, governments seeking to intervene, oftentimes they may say, like, the Orange Revolution worked over there. How about a gray revolution in Belarus? Just the same formula, just transpose it to another country next door, and it's almost, what's the difference? And to me, it strikes me as a similar oversight that often might happen with languages, that people gloss over the nuances or more than nuances between languages, and in so doing, you miss some really important things. And I wonder if you've found that back and forth. You touched on some of it earlier in your experience, crossing back and forth like that, where you find that those oversights or assumptions really can create troublesome situations in language or translating or trying to get nuances across.
Well, certainly. I'm not sure if this would be related to languages, but you brought up the idea of an Orange Revolution. And what I find is a big issue with Westerners is that they group all post-Soviet countries together just because they speak Russian. Now, the Maidan, why wasn't there a color revolution in Belarus? Well, the answer to that is that there were several attempts at it. It just all failed. The difference between, say, the color revolution in Ukraine, or I think it was called the Velvet Revolution in Czechia, or the protests we see in Georgia, is that in those countries, Ukraine, Georgia, Czechia, the dictatorships were not established. They were only in power for a few years. Yanukovych was, oh, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was in power for 4 years at the time of Maidan. Lukashenko hasn't been in power since before I was born. His power structure is far, far, far more cemented. And in 2020 and 2021, the revolution in Belarus was a color revolution, I suppose, in nature, where people came out peacefully, protested, and at certain points there were 100,000 protesters out in one place, but at the peak of Maidan, I believe there were 50,000 protesters. It's just because a movement works in one place of the world doesn't mean it'll work in another, even when seemingly on the surface the two countries seem very, very similar. Is that kind of what you're hinting at with that? I didn't quite I didn't fully understand your question.
Yeah, I was just sort of trying to make that comparison, that a lot of times people confuse seemingly similar countries because they speak a common language, and have some similar histories or linked histories. And a lot of times, in my limited experience with languages, I've seen a sort of similar blurring of lines that people make assumptions about what they think they understand, and that can come out when you're doing something as nuanced as translating.
Well, certainly. And I was actually recently watching a Lex Friedman podcast with Fiona Hill, former presidential advisor on Russia, and she made a very interesting point in relation to the Donbass region, where the Donbass region, which is an industrial region in the east of Ukraine, where obviously a lot of the fighting is happening right now, a lot of the issues in 2014 with the separatism that occurred there, the Russian-sponsored separatism, occurred because the Donbass region has an identity that is very much dissimilar to that of Kiev and the urban centers of Ukraine. And where Fiona Hill, she made the point that the Donbass region had more in common with the fellow industrial region of northeast England, more so than the Ukrainian regions of Kiev and Lvov. And this really dissimilarity in the cultures and experiences of the people living there proves to be a fostering point for much division. We see this in an Irish example in Northern Ireland, where seemingly parts of the island that are right next to each other, they might have completely separate ideas for where the country is going. That's why nationalist-oriented view of internal politics is a very, very, very questionable thing. And as we can see from this conflict, these internal national difficulties, which they are certainly difficulties, but I highly doubt that any sort of civil war would have occurred in eastern Ukraine without the backing of Russia. So we need to be very aware of that. Just because regions are in the same country does not mean that they are exactly the same to other regions in that country, and that these differences are something that can be exploited by external actors.
Well, thanks for that question and answer. I understand that Riverside Kitty may have a question as well. Did you want to go ahead?
Oh, okay, sure. I didn't want to interrupt the political conversation, but I was wondering, I see that you guys at War Translated do have a Patreon. I'm wondering if most of you are working volunteer, or what's going on over there with all the hard work you do.
Well, that's an excellent question and a segue, which was something that I was supposed to mention, but I completely forgot, frankly. That yes, we would. I'd like to shout out the Patreon. Maybe Michael will put a link to it in the nest. But no, we do not get paid. We are volunteers. We do this in our own spare time, and that is one of the limiting factors of it. Where people sometimes after a day at work, they're just tired. That's why I admire Dmitry so much, because he just does so much work, and it's totally in his spare time. We don't get paid, but there are costs involved in it. We have a website, wordtranslated.com. That there's hosting costs in relation to that. I think I briefly mentioned before that all the subtitle software that we use also has costs involved. And if we were ever to branch out into more complicated strands of journalism, there would also be costs involved in that. And obviously, if we were to produce more translations, it would be very helpful to have a bit of extra capital, whether that be to be able to pay us so we can take on the work on top of being voluntary on a part-time basis to supplement our regular income, or whether that be to hire external translators to help out. But the Patreon would really contribute to this project. So I'd like to reiterate by shouting that out.
That was a great question. Good. I'm glad we got that reminder in for you. Exit, did you want to go ahead with the question?
Please. Are there pieces that you guys have been asked to translate that don't get published for certain reasons?
That's a good question. Now, I can't seem to recall any in recent memory, but, well, the closest, I suppose, would be Arestovich, where we have been asked not to publish him, where, and we accepted that and decided to stop doing him. But we try to be kind of objective in our translations. We even translate the most pro-Russian posts, the most deranged rants. We even translate those. But I can't seem to think of any where we were asked and we did not. Perhaps the only one would be if Dmitry was asked to translate something and he was so swamped by work that he just said, I don't have enough time for this. But I don't think we've ever refused to translate something, no.
Would you like to go ahead with another question, Exit?
Thank you. Sorry, I have a bunch. I really was excited that you were coming to speak. You've obviously translated a whole bunch of things. Is there anything in particular that really sticks in your mind as being notable / memorable / poignant, I guess?
Well, my two, I suppose, favorite things to translate, if you could call them that, were the Arestovich streams and, as we call them, Doomer Gherkin's posts. The Arestovich streams were, I kind of liked translating them because I think I translated literally dozens of them by the time we stopped doing it. So, and he always follows a structure. So it's a lot easier to translate where you know what's coming and you can anticipate it. And Arestovich, he speaks clearly enough. He speaks an understandable language. So it was just easy to translate. And, you know, when you keep doing something over and over, the routine gets much easier. In terms of the Gherkin posts, I think that was another one that I enjoyed translating because it provided an authentic view into the Russian side of things, wherein he discussed all the problems, and he also wrote in relatively simple language. But a nuance with Gherkin is that he often uses sarcasm and certain Russian phrases that non-Russian speakers would not understand. So Gherkin is one of the sources where automatic translation would not pick him up well whatsoever. But overall, I'd say Arestovich was my favorite to translate. It's almost a pity that he ended up having the opinions that he did. If people don't know, he kind of when the Dnipro missile attack happened, I believe it was the 14th of January. Don't remember the exact date, but he basically said that the missile did not purposefully strike the building, but it struck it because of being shot down by Ukrainian air defense. So he kind of indirectly placed the blame for the deaths of the victims on Ukrainian air defense. And Ukrainian society was obviously very annoyed at him for that. Another reason that people kind of stopped liking Arestovich was that he started his nature was one that at the start of the war he was known as the uspokaivatel, the relaxer, I suppose would be the translation, where he would package bad news in such a way to give people hope about the course of the war. Now, at the start of the war, that was very much appreciated. But as the war went on, and obviously it became kind of more of a long-term conflict, all these promises of the West will give us 500 tanks within 2 months started kind of annoying more than reassuring. So he kind of, he was a good source to translate, but it's not morally feasible for us to keep translating him when so many Ukrainians have expressed their wishes to us in the comments where we don't want to hear from this guy. And our purpose is to help the Ukrainian people be heard across the world, and obviously kind of accentuating a source that they don't want them to represent them would obviously be a very poor way of doing that. So yes.
That's really interesting insight into your purpose, but also how just fundamentally the cultural perceptions have changed in Ukraine in general over the last year. I only have one more question for you. I noticed that you have posted about some historical books that you read, and there's a number of us here who have been looking at the history of Russia and how that relates to this specific conflict. Is there any one book that you would pick out and say, hey, if you want to grab a piece of history that is relevant, this is what you should read?
I could, in terms of Russia book, I don't think I could actually recommend you, or Ukrainian book. See, these are such broad topics that I don't think I can recommend one book to you. I would recommend, just in terms of this conflict, I really enjoyed the book Barbarossa by Jonathan Dimbleby, where there's a lot of analogies, so to speak, where we with the current conflict. But I would say if one wanted to understand the history of Russia, a very good way to go about it would be to go about it not from the historical textbook side of things, but from the literature type of things. The Russian psyche is one that is very, very different from the European one. And if you understand the Russian psyche, it becomes much easier to understand their history. So one book that I would recommend in particular is War and Peace. It's a long read, obviously, but it helps you grasp the Russian psyche in a way that few other books do, I think. Not to get too literature based here, since this is an open source intelligence space after all, but I am a very big fan of Dostoevsky, and something that few people know was that Dostoevsky was actually an imperialist, where he hated the Poles, he hated certain groups that were non-Russian. So he wrote beautifully, but he also had some controversial opinions. And if you read him, you really get the sense of the Russian psyche. I think he's one of the best sources for that. I know I went on a very kind of obscure rant about Russian literature there, but I couldn't recommend a single book on Russian history. I'm sure there's many, many, many. In terms of a source of learning a Ukrainian history, I would highly recommend Timothy Snyder's Yale lecture series, which is available on YouTube. He really goes about it top to bottom, and he covers not just the events, which can get a bit boring, but he also covers topics such as the nationhood of Ukraine, the dynamics of the Ukrainian language, certain aspects of the Ukrainian psyche and their literature. It's just I don't know what episode he's on right now. I don't think I'm fully caught up with it, but the ones that I have seen, they've just been an amazing series that have a kind of an all-encompassing thing of Ukrainian history. So yes, the Yale series by Timothy Snyder would be my number one source for Ukrainian history. Another interesting source on YouTube, kind of a shorter format, would be a podcast, not a podcast, excuse me, a playlist made by a channel called, well, it wasn't actually one channel. It was a playlist called Project Ukraine, where it's a series of videos detailing Ukrainian history from ancient times to modern times. It's a playlist that's contributed to by many channels. So there's a variety of topics covered. So if you want to say, learn about the Russian kind of oppression of Ukrainians during the Holodomor, or about the ancient Kievan Rus, there's a lot of really beautiful visual videos about in that video series. So Project Ukraine. A book about the Holodomor, which I would recommend. It's not just about the Holodomor. It's again Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. It excellently covers the history of atrocities in the Eastern European region during the 30s and World War II period, and I believe there's a bit on it after World War II. It's not just Ukraine specific, it also goes into detail about Russia, Poland, Belarus, etc. But Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin, which I think an element of the book that I really like is that it doesn't really equate Hitler and Stalin. It compares both and shows that both were genocidal dictators, not just one of them. And it's very well researched. It's very well sourced, and it's a difficult read, certainly, when you realize how much struggle and bloodshed the region has experienced. But yeah, those would be the sources I recommend. So in summary, Timothy Snyder Yale series, Timothy Snyder Bloodlands, Project Ukraine on YouTube, and then read Russian literature.
With regard to whether that's a digression, we may be a space to discuss OSINT news, but we're all individuals as well, and understanding the context that some of those projects provide, is critical to being better analysts. And it's also just interesting to hear, the people who are doing this work, like Stephen, they're real people too. And so I like to get that personal insight. And I had not heard about that shared YouTube playlist before, so I'll definitely go and check that out. Stephen, you've been very generous with your time. I just have one or two very quick questions for you. One is, I don't know whether it's a question or a suggestion, but I'm curious if you have any response to the idea about the potential for the War Translated group to expand, either to cover other areas or more diverse languages. We had Exit suggest, Turkish. We have also had a past speaker interviewed in this space who covers cartel violence in Mexico, who expressed, it would be really handy if somebody who spoke Portuguese well were around, because he'd like to cover cartel engagement in Brazil. Do you have any thoughts on whether there might be interest among the group to sort of broaden it to just translators more broadly for the purposes of OSINT, or do you think it's a group that is very much focused on the war in Ukraine?
In terms of the time commitment, I've all evening, so you don't need to worry about that. If there's any more questions from the audience, I'd be more than happy to answer them. It's very interesting to be given an opportunity sort of to influence the public discussion. But in terms of your question about expanding War Translated, I think I don't speak for everyone in the project. Obviously, I don't know what other people want, especially Dmitry, since he runs the thing after all. But I believe in the idea that one needs to find something they can do well and then do it until they become the best at it. If we were to incorporate a wide variety of translators from all across the world, I feel that our unique selling point, so to speak, of our, I know that I'm looking at it more as a business right now, but still, I think one of our main strengths is that we're all from the region, so to speak. We have a understanding of the region. We know what speakers are respected and what speakers are not. I feel that by integrating translators from other parts of the world, we would kind of dilute that. And I was actually in the space with, I forgot his name, but the cartel speaker, and I did hear him speak about the Portuguese issue where there's not enough translators from Brazil. And I would encourage, obviously, people to take up translating and form their own groups. In fact, you don't need a high skill barrier for this. I'm a 16-year-old high schooler and I do this. So that's just a point where you don't have to be afraid. It's not really hard work. It's more, well, it is hard work. It's more so, it's a time commitment, but you don't really need any qualifications to do it. And it is quite rewarding work. So I would highly recommend people to engage in this sort of work. But going back to your actual question, I don't think we have any plans to expand past the Eastern European region, because that's what we're good at, and we want to keep being good at what we're good at, if that makes sense.
It does, and that's a thoughtful response. And so what that might mean is that we'll have to reach out to the guest we spoke to was All Source News, who tracks cartels, and maybe we'll have to encourage him to collect some people together and maybe create, instead of war translated, something like cartel translated as an option. And so, as often happens, I mean, when you indicated that you have time to answer more audience questions, we've now had a couple more audience members come up with questions. So we will run through a few more before moving on to our open discussion. Wolverine, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I know, like with, when I was in Iraq for the whole time there, one thing we did a lot, and it has to deal more with security than anything else, is, Iraq obviously is a different situation, but sometimes what we have to do is we would have different classifications and different type of translators. And the reason we did that is because you have some areas where sometimes you just can't get enough translators and stuff like that. But the terms we would use is like local hire or U.S. hires. So the difference is that because of where they came from, we could actually employ them in different areas, areas that are, especially might have a classified control area. So what a U.S. hire is someone who is from that region originally, still speaks the language, but currently resides in the United States. And you would actually see a lot of those when we had over there in specific areas where they had to deal with transcribing the language stuff more at like a tactical level for, that would get distributed out to the units. We even had some of them when I went into Iraq in 2015, were some of the ones we had, the U.S. hires were the ones who were the translators for like the prime ministers in certain areas and stuff like that. So the local hires were, kind of like they'd go down with the grunts. They knew the specific region, but there was a lot of stuff that they could not go into, like, to dealing with like our classified briefings and stuff like that. They were there to go on the convoys, and do stuff like that, or like during combat operations, they might have some of the local hires there to assist, but those guys had to be heavily vetted before we could even use them. And the thing is sometimes you get different, you see different things and hear different things. One thing, which, is there anybody who's like Arab or Iraqi here, sorry for, but like when we'd get some of the U.S. hires, they said, it's like, hey, if you ever come across an Iraqi who's, Muslim, whether it be Shia or Sunni, be very wary of them, especially in Iraq. You probably can't trust them as far as you can throw them. But if you were to come across an Iraqi, who was like, who is a Christian, a Syrian, Chaldean, or one of those ones, and this is the information we get, from U.S. hires sometimes compared to the local hires and stuff that we had to be aware of, and so it goes back and forth. He's like, well, which one's better, and it just depends on what you need them for and how you're going to employ them in that specific area.
Wolverine's comments broaden the concept of translation, because we've only been discussing it in the context of online work, and particularly the war in Ukraine. But of course, that dynamic of in-person translation, real world, people who may have to put themselves at risk while translating, it's a whole other set of considerations that Wolverine makes great points about. And so I appreciate that. Oh, I hear my mic is out, so I'll let my co-host Jakub go ahead.
Thanks, Michael. While you get your mic back on track, I'll go to Skykiss, and then I also have a question for Stephen when he comes back. I think we're just getting him back up, so maybe you can wait just 1 second, Skykiss, while he reconnects.
She dropped out there. And can you hear me now? I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, sorry.
No, we can hear you. Michael's just readjusting his mic as well. So we'll go to Skykiss, and then I had another question for you. Go ahead, Skykiss.
Yes, thanks. It's very brief. I wanted to second ideas that you and Exit posited, especially in regard to Turkish translation that Exit mentioned. I feel very strongly that would be a real a positive addition to this entire war and what we're generally trying to do in the OSINT spaces and Word translated, excellent work. I think it would really add to. I understand what Stephen was saying about limiting their work to what they are best at and what they're so good at, but I think Exit's idea was spot on because of all the ramifications of Turkey and Erdogan's vacillating, on so many things. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. It's been very interesting.
Yeah, well, certainly Turkey is a massive player in the region, and we're seeing more and more engagement with Turkey and Ukraine as partner nations. Like, for example, the defense industries of the two countries are very much intertwined. The new Ada-class frigates for the Ukrainian Navy are being built there. Obviously, Baykar wants to set up a factory in Ukraine, and among other things, Turkish MLRS systems were supplied, Turkish BMC Kirpi MRAPs were supplied. So it's certainly a very important player in the region. It's just, again, to reiterate that Turkish as a Turkic language, it's very much different from Slavic languages. And we were speaking earlier, Michael asked me a question about double checking answers. So for example, when we weren't sure of something, we could send it into the chat and some of us could help each other. In the case of Turkish, this wouldn't be possible because we'd only get 1 or 2 people in and they'd just be working among themselves. So I think I would certainly encourage, and I would be very, very, very glad to see some Turkish, I suppose, version of Word Translated come together. But I just don't see how it could integrate into our platform, in that the whole point of having a series of people is that those people can coordinate and help each other. And I think that that sort of advantage would kind of be lost when there's such a barrier between the two languages. But I'd like to reiterate that, yes, Turkey is a massive player, and obviously there's like 80 million people living in Turkey, plus the massive demographics of Turks not in Turkey. So it's a massive marketplace, so to speak, for anyone who speaks Turkish in the audience. I would highly recommend for them to start some sort of translation work, but it's just not something that falls within our spectrum, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Which, for the reasons we discussed before, is totally understandable. But given the interest in a couple of regions, it struck me that it would be great if even those of us who are just interested in open source information, who may not be speakers, to promote or try to find people who, could form pools of translation potential for regions that, might need it down the road. So, for example, if there were extremely high tensions, say, involving the Koreas or Japan or China, many of the networks that have developed to follow the events in Ukraine wouldn't be able to cover that material. And so building some of these connections in advance, I think, might be very valuable in responding to a sudden, change in geopolitics. So it's something I have in the back of my mind. Just how to accomplish it, I'm not entirely sure.
Just to further accentuate your point, I think a region that is very much missing the translation work, where we would really like to see it being facilitated, is the Caucasus, where we kind of, as Russian speakers, we can kind of get a glimpse into the Caucasus, because a lot of people there speak Russian, but still the potential of there's been rising tensions between Iran and Azerbaijan lately. So I think now would be a great time for people, and I think there really would be demand for Caucasian people from the Caucasus to start translating material. I think there would really be a lot of demand for that, and that's a region that I feel has always been a blind spot in Western understanding. And one of the few positive points about this whole war is that the West has become much more aware of the plight of Ukraine, because largely because of efforts such as ours, not to be beating our own drums too much, is where because of us, people have an understanding of the people in Ukraine. And I feel that the Caucasus is suffering through many of the same issues as Ukraine is, and I believe that the West would pay far more attention to the plight of people in that region if they were just to understand what's going on better. So to any people, again, this is kind of a call to action, where you yourself can make a massive impact, because we're just a few random people, and we've had tens of millions of impressions probably over the past few months. So it would be really great to see that region, which has also been oppressed by many empires, kind of get their own voice in the Western media diaspora. So yeah.
And so I partly use these spaces not only to compare notes on what people are doing, but hopefully to brainstorm a little bit about what would be good to do. And while if we were going to do it, individuals of us who are organizing this, we would have to go and do it offline. But I do hope that some people listening who might have some ability on this front get inspired and either do it on your own or reach out and let us know what you can do, and we'll try and build a bigger network. Jacoby, did you want to go ahead with a question?
Yes, please. Thank you so very much for staying this amount of time and taking so many questions. It's really interesting to hear you answer so many different types of questions on translation and the work that you do, and the collaboration that you engage in, which is really interesting too. We have a friend of the space who does a lot of translating using the kind of tools I had mentioned before with DeepL and Google Translate and some other methods. And he has in the past, and forgive my ignorance, I'm not exactly sure how he does it or the extent to which it's working given API issues with Twitter right now, but he aggregates a lot of sites, posting from sites on Telegram and from Twitter, and he uses that mass aggregation of communications in Russian and Ukrainian to translate them into English and disperse them, either to amplify Ukraine's story, message, news, information, or to reveal the messaging coming from Russian accounts in different ways. And I wonder, in your experience, we talked a little bit before about your feelings about automated translation, and we've talked a lot about with him about using this kind of mass aggregation and amplification, or raising awareness about social media communications in different ways, whether related to the Ukraine war, the war against in Ukraine, or in other conflict areas. And if you have any experience looking at that, evaluating its usefulness or not on the ground with people who would be receiving it, consumers of it.
Well, certainly they are very useful tools. They may not have the highest word for word accuracy, so to speak, but you'll always get the general gist of a message. And another thing is they're much quicker to translate, obviously, than manual translation. So Michael earlier was speaking about a valid point where there's a delay when information is published and when it gets to the Western audiences. And automatic translation has really helped cut down that delay. So even if, let's take a hypothetical example where something happens, someone translates it automatically so people know what's going on, and then someone else comes around and translates it manually to fill in kind of the gaps, the gaps left by automatic translation. So I think just as many things in life and in the military and in everything, it's the two options, they work best in coordination rather than one as opposed to another. But automatic translation is a very powerful tool, and it's very curious to see. Now, obviously, these days we're seeing AI develop at an absolutely exponential, skyrocketing rate, where it's just getting better and better every week, it seems like. And it'd be very curious to see what improvements can be made to the translation aspect of it. But it is certainly a very useful tool, as you said, for mass aggregation of information.
All right. Well, with that, once again, Stephen, thank you very much for giving us so much of your time. I think we've covered a lot of ground and have a much better understanding of the work that you and the whole team over at War Translated do. I will remind people that War Translated has recently opened a Patreon account, and I think that the work they do is certainly worth supporting. So I'd say the first steps are follow Stephen, check out War Translated if you like their work. Give them a follow as well, and hopefully some of these ideas that we've discussed today about building out translation more broadly to support OSINT beyond the specific work that War Translated is engaged in it inspires either some folks listening, or we just build ourselves a nice big network. Jacoby, you had your hand up. Did you want to add one last item?
Oh, I just wanted to say that his the post from Dimitri about the Patreon is in the nest, but I see you just put it up there again. So that was it. And thank you for being here. I appreciate so much of your time.
And hopefully you've had an enjoyable enough discussion that if in a couple of weeks there are any further developments, I know that you're working on great things with your project. Perhaps you would come back on and update us on how things are going.
Well, certainly, and I'd be very much open to coming back. It's been a great experience speaking. It's a great experience for me personally in my development, so to speak. Another issue that I can come back to, obviously it's not within the spectrum of today's discussion, is the feelings within Russia, kind of the opinions, the beliefs, all that. I've recently been, this is kind of a personal project of mine. It's not related to Word Translated. I've been speaking to a variety of people within Russia, and I've just trying to been kind of, it's very interesting for me. I've been trying to gauge what are the feelings, what are the true feelings, because online, unfortunately, in such a contested environment, in information environment, we see two extremes: either all Russians are liberals occupied by Putin waiting to overthrow him, or all Russians eat Ukrainian children for breakfast, and so on. So I think that's an area that I thought I would add a bit more nuance to perhaps some other day. But other than that, it's been a pleasure being on the space. The questions I was asked were very good. I'd like to compliment everyone who asked a question because they were very interesting to answer. And yeah, well, thanks for having me, and I'd be more than willing to be on again. Thanks.
We look forward to that. Okay, guys, we're going to transition in a moment into our hopefully what will be an engaging roundtable discussion. The way I normally work through this is in the thread that I have, it's up in the nest, that sets out the agenda. I have a lot of resources that I put together, about 12 hours in advance, trying to keep it fairly topical. And I'll go through some of these news items on the discussion topics. If anything sparks your interest that you'd like to, a detail you'd like to add in, or a question you'd like to ask, then please request the mic. It's the button in the bottom left of the Spaces window. And if you're enjoying the conversation and you think others might as well, please retweet the space. It's in the bottom right of the Spaces window. And also a reminder, if you've joined us just in the last hour or so, friends of this space are also streaming some of this content on YouTube. And there was a link to that in the nest that will move up toward the front of the space, or front of the nest, in just a moment. So even if you prefer to stay here and listen, you may be interested in checking it out later, as there will be a bit of an archive of our content there. So I was hoping to provide a few more updates on some past matters that we've discussed in the space. So at the beginning, I referred to some updates based on the downing of the US drone. And the next item I was hoping to speak to was some speculation about Russian manpower. And so a lot of these next few points, they're unconfirmed, but it seems like when you look at logistics, the Russians are likely going to run into a manpower issue again in the coming months. And so these rumblings about a potential further call-up they're rumor now, but they kind of set the context, the outline for what may develop. So the second item in the nest, it's a tweet by Mike Eckel. He's passing along an article that was written by, I presume it's an acronym, URARU, which is a Russian news source who has some contacts in the Russian Ministry of Defense. And the claim they're publishing is that regional governments have begun to receive quota targets for recruiting. And apparently the total target across all Russian regions for what they're calling a volunteer campaign is 400,000 more soldiers by the end of 2023. Now this is it's a single source, and it's a Russian source at that. But given that the call-up that began in September of 2022 and lasted through about December, it is reported to have drawn a little over 300,000 in 3 months in what was a very rushed and under-resourced way. The idea that they may try to draw 400,000 in the remaining 9 months of the year isn't outrageous. Of course, it leads to questions about what the political implications may be within Russia, given that when they mobilized 300,000, it's understood that probably at least another 500,000 people left the country to avoid mobilization. And so it's unclear how significant this might be as if they do begin this mobilization process, this might be as a driver for more people to try to leave the country. Connected with that is the third item in the nest. It's a tweet by Tatar Gami, who is a Ukrainian, he sounds like he's a Ukrainian officer who often writes on tactical matters around Vuhledar. And he has noted he's receiving information that Russia has intensified efforts to verify the service eligibility, which would often be a precursor to further mobilization. At the same time, it was also reported that Russia has raised the conscription eligibility age to 30 just in the last few days. So these are further indications they may be getting ready, which is further inspired by the tweet back in the nest by Dan Saba, who he's a UK-based reporter who has connections, and he is saying that a senior NATO official, speaking anonymously, has said that Russia is sustaining between 1,200 and 1,500 casualties per day. And if you start to do the math on that, you rapidly see why they may have to begin a new mobilization process. I know that many had thought they might actually begin it potentially in January of this year, so that it might be ready with new recruits, minimally trained to match up the timing of a potential Ukrainian offensive. But having missed that window, if they don't begin, now, they won't be available for several months. So they may actually be timing it in anticipation of losses resulting from that offensive. But Wolverine has his hand up. What do you have to say?
So there are a couple of things on that with the 400,000 troops. I can't remember if it was ISW I read it on or one of the regular, mainstream media sources. But one of the things that they said is that, if I remember correctly, is that they're not so much as looking to use these forces directly in combat operations in Ukraine as they are to try and build their force up to a more professional force, kind of like what we do here in the United States. So it looks like they're trying to, get away from the conscription, as far as, to where, because they're really restricted by, what they can do with conscripts. But if they make them as contract soldiers, it gives them more leeway with those soldiers they can actually do with, they could sit there and say, yeah, we can actually send them into Ukraine, or we can send them out here to do this or whatnot. So that was one thing. It was like two different sources. I want to say, I think one of them was ISW. They said it maybe a week ago. And then I also saw on another news source, and I sorry that I read this stuff and then you guys bring it up and I'm like, crap, I can't remember who this source was now, but it's, if I'm bringing it up, it's because I've actually actively read it and have seen what it can do to. But it doesn't sound like Russia is going to try and go with what they have directly in there, because it's not only, it's like, we saw in the beginning where, the troops are going undersupplied and not properly equipped and stuff like that. And if they were to try to do that, I think it would only exacerbate everything that's going on, making it worse on the Russians, because they're still upgrading T-62s. They're bringing to the combat, and it's actually even gotten to the point where they're bringing old BTR-50s. They're built in 1954, give or take, because they need more armored personnel carriers to bring troops into the combat zone. So with that being said, it's like if they're already pulling that kind of equipment out of storage, then it was like, okay, well then if you guys are doing this, then what do you guys even, equip them with? I mean, yeah, they probably have like a trillion AK-47s in storage somewhere and the ammo for it because they've been producing them since God knows when. But I mean, when you get down to the point of, of equipping your troops and putting them in, 70-year-old armored vehicles, unless they upgrade them and do some stuff like that, I mean, they're basically going to end up serving like how the United States did with the old M113s, which is, your M113s are designed to only go so far forward, and then you drop the troops off and then they back off or in a little bit, and they may provide fire support. But if you're going to try and use these BTR-50s, as IFVs, well, then you're just like sitting there and like writing a bunch of death sentences for these soldiers who are going into it. So with all that equipment, it's kind of showing that, yeah, they can want to pull these 400,000 troops, but to be able to do that and put them into the combat zone in Ukraine with proper equipment and or training or weapons and munitions, it sounds like a bad situation that you're already going to place all these troops into.
And so Wolverine makes some great points. I know that Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, had said about a month and a half ago that their intention to expand the Russian military by, I believe it was 500,000. But that was a longer term plan over the next, I think it was 3 or 4 years. And so it strikes me that the rumor of 400,000 in the next year may be in addition to that longer term, more professional plan. And when I bring these things up, I don't bring them up, to scaremonger, but to think about, if you look at Russian loss rates, they won't be sustainable on the scale of, 6 months, 8 months. And so they will have to, to the extent they're going to continue to pursue the war, they likely will have to engage in a mobilization at some point. And it's just trying to see whether there are plausible indications of that coming up anytime soon. And of course, Wolverine's point about, equipping these personnel, and that it sounds crazy to call this group up when they may not have the equipment for them. I absolutely agree, but that didn't seem to stop the Russians from pursuing an under-resourced mobilization plan from September through December. And that while it appears like it's generated a huge number of casualties, it also did appear to have some effect at slowing Ukrainian advances in some regions, like around Kupiansk and Svatov. So, it's my thinking is it's best to try to pay attention to these indicative factors, but not give them too much weight, which is why I raised them here, just for your consideration. But I appreciate. Yeah, go ahead.
One other thing I did want to say is like about the numbers, about like how many troops have been killed, and it's gone back and forth on how many troops are actually being killed on the Russian side, killed and or lost. Because if you're sitting there saying 30 days in 1,000 troops a day, that's literally 300,000 troops. And I think which I kind of got pointed this out to by someone, by Faye, I believe it was, is that he said it's a cumulative accounting of the troops. And then there was another, this one I think was like, let's try and remember this one. It was either off like the Ukraine Mil UA site or something like that. But what was happening is sorry for the traffic, can't help that. But what they were saying is that it's not that they're actually losing 1,000, but when you look at the time periods and the different areas and stuff like that. So what he was saying is, which Faye was saying, and then I actually looked it up and found some data and I shared it with him, is that you are losing like example, let's say we take the Salvatore criminal line, right? They're losing about anywhere from 40 to about 180 troops a day. Okay. Now, that's in just that one area. That's, that's from the whole, all the way from, I think basically from Lyman to Cremona to Salvatore. So, you're looking at least, they're losing a company's worth of guys every day. And then, if you go down to like Bakhmut, you might have slightly higher, or you may just have that same amount, because and I'm talking casualties and like dudes killed only, not wounded. And then, we move down to Avdiivka, Donetsk area, and then Volodar, because those are like basically the four main areas where you have the heaviest fighting going on right now. So yeah, you could be losing about, on the worst case, about 500 troops a day, low end side, 180 to 200 troops a day. But then if you look at that over a week period and stuff like that, well, yeah, that is equal up to, that many troops. So you kind of got to look at the different ways of how they're reporting them, because the Ukrainians their numbers are estimates. They're not always exactly, hey, this is how many dudes been killed and stuff like that. So the actual number of how many troops are actually dying in the whole war zone, it's going to have a huge disparity between the actual numbers. Now, Ukraine, they're saying like 150,000, but that 150,000, last I checked, is like, KIA and WIA. Now, on the WIA side, that doesn't include guys. Let's say let's say it's at 150,000, right? They have 50,000 straight up dead, 100,000 who are WIA, right? But now, how many of those WIA have actually been returned to the front lines or are back out fighting? So you see that only not from the Russian side, but you also see it from the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainian side, lots of times they just don't report it. It's not because like they don't want to, but the guys are like, hey, don't report this at the higher up because I want to go back into the fight. Because certain type of injuries they do have to report, and the dudes want to get out back, into the fight and fight against the Russian forces.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. The ability for, it may be counted as a casualty, but I have heard that the majority of sort of off the front line instances for Ukrainians only result in a day or so off the line, and then
correct.
A very high proportion go back in. So
Yes,
I
just saying that's the only thing I want to say on that was that's mainly because of like the medevac procedures for the Ukrainian side compared to the medevac procedures for the Russian side.
Yeah, absolutely. And many sources are reporting similar things, that the killed to wounded ratio for Russia is probably somewhere between 2 and 3. And the killed to wounded ratio on the Ukrainian side is like multiples higher, whether it be, instead of being 1 to 3, it's 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 in any event. So we are working with estimates, but that one figure of 12 to 1,500 for the Russians over the last few weeks was coming from apparently a senior NATO source who wanted to remain anonymous, as reported by British press. So moving on, another topic we've discussed before, I just wanted to bring up again, is the Russian civilian aviation industry. So there are 3 items in the nest on this. The first of which is a discussion of a specific example. It was a Russian 767 that suffered engine failure while trying to take off from an airport in Thailand. And it was explained that in this thread that because the company that had been providing service to these Boeing aircraft stopped servicing them for Russian airlines several months ago, apparently the history of its prior service wasn't transferred over to the new servicing company. And this particular plane had been due for an engine inspection, potentially overhaul, almost at the time that the Western maintenance company stopped doing its work. And so it was due, but it's now been flying for 12 months without the required inspection. And in this case, it blew out on takeoff my understanding is that there were no casualties in this incident, but it's probably indicative of the type of thing that's happening with several aircraft. So increasingly the safety of Russian airlines is in question. Connected with that idea, so there's the idea about Western companies providing service to Russian aircraft in Russia. And given that service has been withdrawn, many Russian airlines started going to maintenance companies based in Turkey. But then just 3 days ago, it was announced that Turkey would no longer be providing service to airplanes produced by Airbus and Boeing in the United States. So that as a fallback for aircraft service is no longer an option. And then the third item back in the nest is another example of Russian civilian aircraft losses, and it's specific to a smaller regional jet type called the Superjet 100. And apparently there are already reports that several of these aircraft are just having to be taken out of service because as parts are breaking down, the spare part pool has expired. And so some are already out of service. And apparently the projection in the article that is at the bottom of this thread is that up to 40% of this one type of aircraft may be completely out of service by this summer. I think in here they note that Russia has 160 of these type of aircraft in service. And so if 40% of them go out of service, then that's 64 planes that just aren't flying, which is going to start to create economic problems just for the ability of, business to be conducted within Russia. The last item I wanted to update on, which is something that we've discussed in the space before, is the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And she has been kind enough. Exit is with us today. Exit was one of our guests last week when we were talking about the dynamics around the renewal of the grain exports. And there have been some significant developments just in the last day or two. So I'll put those resources up in the nest if Exit, you might be willing just to let us know what's developed. Has the deal been renewed?
Maybe, kind of, sort of. So yesterday morning, we saw, which I guess would have been afternoon in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Minister of Infrastructure came out with a tweet that said that the Black Sea Grain Initiative had been renewed for 120 days, which was notable because that was very different than what Russia had said, which was 60 days all along, that they were only willing to confirm for 60 days. So I reached out to the UN and talked to the source there, and they were able to confirm that there was a renewal, but notably did not tell me how many days it was. And then when their actual note to correspondence, so their official update, came out a couple hours later, it again didn't have any specific days, how many days are left in the renewal. Erdogan also mentioned it in a speech he was making yesterday morning. Again, no mention of the renewal length. So subsequent to that, Russia has come out with two statements stating that the renewal is only for 60 days. And the UN, Turkey, and Ukraine have not commented on it further than those original documents. So essentially right now we have a renewal. It's going to work for at least 60 days, and then we get to see what happens after that. In 57 days, there is so I guess it'd be 56 days today, there is the Turkish elections to see if Erdogan is still the president there. And then it would be 59 days, so 3 days after that, the grain deal could possibly expire if Russia pulls out at 60 days. Notably, Russia did not say, hey, we won't do the renewal. And so technically, they have agreed to 60 days, is my understand, or sorry, they have agreed to 120 days because they didn't officially say, no, we won't agree to the renewal. But holding that to that is going to be difficult. So we have a renewal. Things will keep trucking for at least 60 days. What happens after that time probably has a great deal to do with what happens in Turkey in the next 2 months. As I mentioned last week, anybody in Turkey will tell you that 2 months is a very, very long time. And we don't know what will happen in Turkey in 2 months. And so it's the place to watch. That's specifically why I was asking about Turkish translation, because watching what happens as we go forward in Turkey probably has a direct correlation to what we see happen with Russia and Ukraine in the coming weeks.
Given that connection to Turkey, have there been any new updates from the Turkish opposition about how they might handle either relations with the EU, NATO, or specifically the Grain Initiative?
You'll have to forgive me. In the last 3 days, it's all a little bit blurry because there's been so much going on. I don't strictly remember anything from the opposition being said. Generally, they are quite positive on the EU and NATO, very friendly to them. And they've talked about working closely with them in their foreign policy, but also still maintaining a relationship with Russia. We did also see, though, this week that, as you mentioned, Turkey said that they would no longer supply the U.S. planes. We also saw them stop the parallel imports that are going through Turkey to Russia. They have definitely made some moves that likely didn't make Russia very happy, but exactly what will happen if the opposition were to actually win, I don't think that we have a whole bunch more clarity on that at this point.
Okay, well, thanks for that update. We'll keep an eye on that and provide updates on both developments in Turkish politics, because it affects so many aspects of things, but then also specifically on the Grain Initiative in the next couple of weeks, in case we get more clarity over whether Russia is really going to try to end things after 60 days. Jacoby, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think you just might want to check your mic again. It's a little robotic. And while we're waiting for Michael to do that, I also wanted to I know we sort of rounded out that segment. Oh, before I go to that, I see Jason, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question. It was regarding some of the stuff just mentioned about Turkey. One thing that I'm curious about, Turkey's, of course, as part of NATO, has been providing a certain amount of support to the effort underway. They happen to have one very interesting aircraft, which is, I believe it's been designated an E-7 Wedgetail. It's the next generation AWACS aircraft. And I believe this is actually an Australian one, but no, I think it's the Turkish one. So Turkey has one, and it's been getting utilized off the Black Sea on a regular basis. So I'm wondering if Turkey may now stop allowing NATO to utilize that asset, or if that would come up in any sort of these really interesting diplomatic moves on both sides.
Are you suggesting that Turkey might not use it over the Black Sea given the downing of the U.S. drone, as in the risk is too high, or are you suggesting it might be politically motivated?
I'm suggesting it might be politically motivated because they have been they've been regularly utilizing this particular aircraft right along the Romanian border on the Black Sea for the last couple of weeks. So it's just one of those things that, considering Turkey's sort of tenuous position between NATO and Russia. Is it one of those things that may become a demand of Russia that, hey, you have to stop utilizing it? I mean, it is like it is the next generation AWACS aircraft, so it is probably has capabilities that are well above our E3 Sentry AWACS. So. But it's just one of those things. I'm just curious if politically it may wind up becoming a pawn in this game.
That's an interesting question. From the Turkish political side, I don't have a view on that. Two things, though, that might be interesting to you. One is just before our space started, a video was put up. It's now the first item in the nest. And it was apparently a similar attempt by Russian fighter aircraft to try to down a Bayraktar TB2. And the description of the video doesn't say whether it's a Ukrainian TB2 or a Turkish TB2, but it seems like the aggressive approach to drones doesn't just apply to the American ones. In this case, the Bayraktar recovered and it didn't crash, but it's interesting footage. The other point is the E7 presumably has much more powerful sensors. And if Russia is being particularly bold nearer to the coast and they're using as a fig leaf this claim of, the aircraft being in the NOTAM area, I presume that the E7 could probably do its work from a little bit greater distance, even though it would still be over the Black Sea. And so it may be, technically at a little less risk, but that's speculation on my part. But it's a good question you raise. I see a few hands have gone up who may want to answer this. Before going to them, I'll go to Jacoby as co-host.
Thank you. I will wait. I had another question for exit, so I will just keep my hand up and defer to others.
Sure. We'll go to Polaris first and then Wolverine.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to touch quickly on the question with regards to the E7. There are other NATO assets already operating in the Black Sea and have continued to do so in the aftermath of the crash attempt, if you will, of the Reaper drone. So in the broader scheme of things, while it would be nice to have more Turkish engagement, it doesn't really impact NATO's ability to know what's going on in that region in near real time.
Thanks for that. Wolverine, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, even though we lost the Reaper, they've still sent a Global Hawk back out there, and I don't know what this E7 aircraft is. I'm not really don't pay attention to Turkey all that time, but AWACS is one thing, and if the E7 is a collection aircraft, that's a different job than what the E3 AWACS does. We have different aircraft that can actually do that besides the E3, but the U.S. still has its Global Hawk up there still flying. There was actually a big press release where they actually said that they were still sending it up. So, I mean, technically, as long as it's flying over international airspace, the Russians can try and pull some of the BS they did. But if they do something against the Global Hawk, we'll see what happens. But that Global Hawk that has been up there has been literally flying up there since prior to the invasion, and they're still sending him up. So it may have been that the Russians did it because of the type of aircraft that the Reaper is, and that's maybe why they've never messed with the Global Hawk, and they did mess around with the Reaper.
Interesting thought. We'll go to ID10T and then back to JS Lind. Go ahead, ID.
Staying on topic here, but one of the reasons why Russians said that they were authorized for whatever reason, because the Reaper was inside of the NOTAM area or whatever. It's international waters, and we can completely disregard that. But to the E7, especially being a manned aircraft, this is a Boeing aircraft. And while Turkish Air Force might use it, it's still an American Boeing and modified by Boeing subsidiary in Australia. Australia is the ones who spearheaded the development of the E-7. And if we fly it around the Black Sea, we'll stay within our perimeters. But if Russia has a complaint about that, we'll tell them to go smoke a insert derogatory term here. They don't have any say into it. And the benefits that the E-7 brings is that it's a next generation multifunctional array. So it goes beyond the traditional AWACS capabilities, and this becomes a multi-platform that can do, list goes on, many of things.
I appreciate your discretion there, and people trying to figure out your derogatory term might have to do a little bit of OSINT work to figure out what you were referring to. J.S. Lynn, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, this is strictly in political terms. Look, we've had, just about every type of ISR platform up there, from Rivet Joints to, T3 Centuries to the both Artemis project platforms are out there now. Every single ISR platform's there. Of course, yeah, Global Hawk, both ours, and it's either Italy's or NATO's, make regular incursions over the Black Sea. Although, as a result of this latest one, the very, very last Black Sea flight that we were able to track, which was Forte 10, it did just basically a singular pass over the Black Sea rather than a continual sweep over a narrow region, and spent most of its time in Romania. So, that likely was a response to the downing. But again, just as far as the E-7 goes, I know we've got tons of assets up there. We're watching them constantly. This doesn't even include, satellites, etc. It's just a question of, because the E-7 is the newest platform and is being used in theater, it isn't actually over the Black Sea. It's right on the border. It literally sits on the coast off, right inside Romania. Just would they be, and because it's Turkish, the Turkish Air Force, would Russia start using that as, some sort of negotiating thing? I'd like to get away from just the idea of, we can see what's going on because we all know that. It's more the political implications.
Given the steps that Turkey has taken in the last week on the political front, both the aircraft repair and the parallel imports like the sanctions evasion, it seems like they're not becoming more friendly toward Russia, and that one of their major interests is being, assertive over their control of the straits. And so I'd imagine that having very good ISR capability up so that they have a good picture so they can, really be assertive over what's happening in the Black Sea, I think is something they would be inclined to maintain. But, that's a sort of distant political analysis. Polaris, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, with respect to the political angle of things, I don't really see the Turks brokering any kind of deal, because this would de facto say certain sections of international airspace are quote unquote now Russian airspace, and they get a say in what you can do in this area. So it would be in your best interest, really, not to set a dangerous precedent that might limit Turkish policymaking for decades to come with respects to the boundaries of international airspace.
Jacoby, I think you might have had a more general question about Turkey for exit.
Actually, I sort of had a more specific question about grain for exit, so I'm happy to wait if we want to stay on Turkey.
I will allow it. Go ahead.
So I noticed in looking at some things that you had posted, Exit, you mentioned something about stolen grain, that you're, if not directly looking at, sort of peripherally keeping an eye on, and keeping an eye on those who are more deeply watching it than you. And I wondered if you had any insight into whether there's more of it, whether it's continuing on unabated, whether it's petered out a little bit, or I imagine it hasn't. It's only increased. But I saw one of your posts that I think you retweeted from Yorick, who had he has some really vivid footage of ships that appear to be, or are said to be, moving stolen grain.
Yeah. It hasn't become any less than it was. I believe York and others, if you watch their feeds, York posts a grain ship leaving at least 2 to 3 times a week, if not more often, if I recall properly. It's consistent. They often ship to Syria, although almost every ship says that it's going to Beirut, Lebanon. They never do. And as far as we can tell, there was even a story this week that we saw a barge being pushed by Russian subs down the river and headed over to Rostov-on-Don, as far as we can tell. So they're not just shipping out of Sevastopol anymore. Now they're shipping out of other places. Grain is still being stolen. Lots of people are covering it. They're doing some really hard work to cover it, and they've made a lot of connections with a lot of people to cover it. This has been a year-long project, if not longer, for a lot of them. And I really recommend giving Yorick a follow. I will make sure that his post is in the nest, but there's a few other of them around as well. So it's consistent, and it probably won't stop anytime soon. I don't know how much planting is going to get done this year in occupied areas. Obviously, there's some bigger issues going on there, but it's something to watch for sure.
Is stolen grain only considered stolen grain when Russia is taking it from Ukraine, or is it also considered stolen insofar as it may not be being counted coming out of Russia, or basically is Russian grain free to flow freely, and they're basically just sort of taking the Ukraine grain and adding it into the quote unquote approved Russian grain?
I don't know the specifics enough to know whether they're actually mixing Russian grain and Ukrainian grain. I will try and ask some questions about that this week. Generally, grain that comes out of Russia is not checked by anybody, and so other than official sources at different locations, we wouldn't necessarily know where that grain's coming from, other than the hard work that these people are doing to track that information. There is, if you go back a couple of months, sorry, I'm just thinking at the same time as I'm talking. If you go back a couple of months, and I'll try and find one, there's a Washington Post story that kind of detailed the information and kind of the tracking, because a lot of this grain, it's stolen from Ukrainian farmers, but then it gets quote unquote purchased by a Russian company and then exported through that company with some fuzzy paperwork all the way along. And so there are people who, and I believe it was the Washington Post and maybe the New York Times, have done stories on it that they've gotten a hold of that paperwork as well. And you can see kind of there's a trail that tracks a lot of it. So at some point down the road, actually trying to prosecute some of these crimes may be viable just because they have done so much work to actually track that. But specifically, ships that carry grain out of Russian ports are not subject to any inspections that I know of.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for the question and answer. Going into some other topics, we've kind of been doing a bit of roundtable at any event. I had wanted to point out some of the nuances in connection with the laying of war crimes charges against Putin. These are details that I have seen largely overlooked. And if they inspire any comments or questions, please do jump in. So the first 2 points that I put up in the nest, the second item back is the actual, it's the tweet that was put up by the International Criminal Court itself that links to its statement and the charges. So if you hadn't seen that original, check it out. It has more detail than, just the breaking news. But speaking of breaking news, I thought it interesting to see the United States reaction. And in particular, because this is a reporter, Alex, who actually tends to frequent the Ukrainian spaces, including ours, from time to time, who actually got the question and answer from President Biden. And so he asked him on the lawn of the White House, the question he asked was, should Putin be tried for war crimes in Ukraine? And Biden's response was, well, he's clearly committed war crimes. Which is a pretty plain answer for a politician. You don't expect to get something that clear very often. So in case you hadn't seen the U.S. reaction, that's one interesting point. I'm just adding to the nest now 1 or 2 points that are about sort of enforcement of these charges. Because, so the Russian reaction, perhaps predictably, is some might have expected the Russians to try to hide it or, to tamp down coverage of their president being charged. But apparently the approach they've taken is the opposite, and they've leaned right in to advertising it widely as a point of pride to say, look how ridiculous it is that they've pressed these charges against our president. They can't possibly enforce them. Look how strong we are. There's no way that these can be applied to us. And of course, there's been there doesn't appear to have been any sort of a public reflection on, well, are these charges true? Are children being kidnapped from Ukraine? Or, in a possibly more safe approach, if you were a Ukrainian or if you were a Russian citizen, rather than saying, are these children being kidnapped, just saying, is this policy a violation of international law? And apparently that reflection hasn't been taking place. But to the extent that the Russians are saying, number one, we don't recognize the court, and number two, this is unenforceable against us, there are interesting responses to that. So there's a tweet up there by Lottie, I believe her last name would be Leicht, who is a former international legal prosecutor, and who also was the EU Director for Human Rights Watch for 25 years. And her response is to note that, yes, while Russia may not be a signatory to the treaties behind the International Criminal Court, Ukraine has, and to the extent that these activities are taking place on Ukrainian territory, the authority of the court under international law pretty clearly applies. So that was an interesting response, and I wanted to highlight her because I believe she's following this issue closely and would be a good follow if you want somebody coming at it from a legal perspective, with more detail than the average. Exit, go ahead.
I'm actually putting my hand up for Stephen, so Stephen can go ahead. His emojis are not working accurately right at the moment.
Okay, so go ahead, Stephen. It may be that his emojis and his ability to speak were both struck at the same time. If that's the case, we'll come back to him. I'm going to assume that's the case, and so maybe go ahead, exit. Mm-hmm.
No, I'll work on that. We'll be right back.
Perfect. We'll bring his question forward in just a moment. So to the extent that Ukraine has signed on to the authority of the International Criminal Court and these events are taking place in Ukraine, the Russian argument about, the authority of the court does not apply doesn't appear to be a substantive legal argument. One other point that's being tossed around is that there's other leaders, national leaders, who have been charged by the International Criminal Court, kind of set a precedent by traveling around internationally for years and not being arrested. And people are pointing to that and saying, oh, well, many countries will not attempt an arrest on these charges, which is it's a fair consideration. But there is a thread up in the nest, it's the second item, by the account Own All the Things, who is a good national security commentator, who again has occasionally spoken on our spaces, who notes that that precedent isn't valid because in the last few years there have been a couple of legal cases.
Michael, I think your audio went quiet.
But I'm back. So as long as my audio is okay, I'll just keep right on going. So there have been some legal cases recently about executive immunity, and it's been determined that a charge against an executive is one case where executive immunity does not apply. And so it's now established international law that a charge of this type, as against Putin, all signatories to the authority of the International Criminal Court should act on it. And so just because others jetted around the world for 10 years without being arrested, that is a matter that has now been decided, and it should not continue in that way. Stephen, did you want to go ahead?
Oh yeah, sorry, I was just having some technical issues. It's just I was speaking to some Russians I knew yesterday, and they had some reactions to the Putin news, which I thought would be interesting, wherein they were speaking about how it was being used by the propaganda to push this agenda, to further push this already existing agenda that the whole world is against Russia and Putin more specifically, wherein they fully embraced the Putin being labeled a war criminal. They did not try to deny it for a second. Instead, they tried to go at it from the angle that the West is one big kangaroo court, and they're just trying to indict all Russians. And this is another actually concern that I've been hearing from them, is that there's an underlying fear in Russian society that there will be some sort of collective punishment due to everything that's gone on in the war. And the reaction to this news that Putin has been indicted, there's kind of been two common reactions, three. So one of these is kind of agreeing with propaganda, just the whole world is against us, blah, blah, blah. We need to win. We need to fight on to the bitter end. So one could argue that these sort of things actually push them to fight harder because out of fear that they themselves will be punished. Another reaction that I actually heard was just of plain apathy, because the Russian psyche, the interesting thing about it is that the Russians have a very cynical view on international law. They love the phrase, the history is written by the victors. That's one of their favorite phrases. They're always very cynical about things like international courts, wherein basically they ignore their judgments unless they're pro-Russian. And the last view on the labeling of Putin as a war criminal was kind of at long last, kind of a very much, how would I explain this? a very much relief almost that he's finally being recognized. So it's very curious to see how much of a wide variety of spectrum of views there were. And also, I was away from keyboard, and I think Riverside Kitty earlier asked a question about what I meant when I said I was 16. You didn't mishear me. I am actually 16 years old, so hopefully that clears some confusion up there.
Well, you're very accomplished for 16 years old, and if you're doing the work, then you can come and tell us all about it. So I appreciate the clarification. Jacoby, did you want to jump in, and then we'll go to JJ?
Yeah, and just your the information you brought up from your back and forth with some Russian people that you encounter. I'm just curious if this is the kind of back and forth that you engage in on social media, or these are people that you encounter in your daily work, or they're people that you seek out who are in Russia, or maybe you can't say at all how you encounter them.
This is people on social media that I knew since before the conflict, kind of before we didn't really care about politics and whatever, but now politics has really permeated all of our discussions, and it's just been very interesting to keep in contact, to know what's going on in their heads, because what I'm referring to is a group of free people, which very interestingly, they all have their own views. One of them is extremely pro-Putin, and he thinks that we should drop a nuke on Kiev. I think he said that once. So, as you couldn't guess, I don't really like talking to him. One of them is extremely pro-Navalny. He's the liberal of the group, so to speak. And the last one, who I think is the most interesting for me, is the person who I believe represents the average Russian attitude to the war, that they're kind of, if you were to bring up an analogy of a child, they're not sorry that they did it, they're sorry that they got caught. He doesn't care about the politics of it. He says he only cares about the people, but he still has this kind of vaguely imperialist view, which I find really interesting, how a person who seemingly cares about people can still believe the agenda of that Russia is destined to rule Eastern Europe. Sorry if I'm derailing your discussion a bit by my Eastern European rambles.
It's that's part of the beauty of having an open mic format, is that what some call derailing, others call adding value. And so I appreciate your comments in any event. JJ, would you like to go ahead?
Thanks, Michael. I am going to ask a broad question on purpose, and it's going back to these arrest warrants from the ICC. I'd like to know what people think about in terms of ramifications beyond these charges, and what we're seeing or what we can expect to see as a result of that. And what I mean by that is that even if it does end up that they're not enforceable, what other impact does this have? Thanks.
Well, I'd invite anybody who'd like to weigh in on that to come up. I've certainly seen everything from, similar to the attitude that Stephen just described. The thinking of, well, now the West is completely committed, that the current Russian regime will not survive, and therefore, that requires Russia to become even more committed as well. But some have said, well, that may be a general effect, but there could be specific targets, including, political elite, business elite within Russia, who will say, well, we can't just rely on going back to the way things were, and therefore, if we can't go, I'll back up. We can't go back to the way that things were under this current leadership. And therefore, it might get them thinking about the requirement for a change in leadership, and or if they were to execute some method to try to change government, they would have, a pathway for, well, we can always just deliver Putin, to the hands of international law. And that way the matter will be resolved. And, there's sort of an established set of implications that come with that. And it would be less of an unknown in terms of, well, what do we do with the existing leadership? But those are very rough considerations. I'll admit I didn't see the hand order, so I'm going to go with Jacoby and then ID10T, and then we'll come around.
I just had a couple comments, and I'm happy to defer to ID10T and back to JJ before I have any comment.
Sure. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, ID. At least for me, you're very quiet. I don't know if you can get closer to the mic or maybe change your headset.
Are we signatories on the ICC? Did we sign it? United States, sorry.
Yeah, you're asking a Canadian, so I'm glad you clarified. My understanding is no, the United States has not signed it. And in fact, there was news about a week ago about the possibility that the Pentagon may be preventing the sharing of some information with the Ukrainians out of fear, like that is connected with evidence of war crimes, out of fear for the precedent it might set for giving additional legitimacy to the ICC. So I know that the American position is, we'll call it complicated on the matter. Jacoby, go ahead.
It's my understanding that the U.S. has signed it, actually, but because the U.S. requires that Congress also ratify treaties, I believe it was Clinton who signed it, and then when it went before the Congress, they refused to ratify it. So I think the idea that it's complicated is accurate.
This is, you see, guys, why we always have a minimum 2-lawyer standard on the panel, so that when I miss something, Jacoby can come through and correct me. JJ, go ahead.
Wanted to add a little bit to the conversation. I see that Constantine is in the audience, but I'm not sure if he's listening at the moment. But I think that I saw something on his page yesterday talking about these charges as well, and saying that this also has a reflection on any politician outside of Russia who chooses to further associate with Putin, and wondering if there's any comments on that.
Well, it's interesting you should raise that. I'll put it in the nest now, but it's one of the points I wanted to make. It's been pointed out that the very first leader to be meeting with Putin after being charged will be Chinese President Xi, and that even more than just his being charged, Putin, it appears he may have timed his decision to go and visit Crimea and Mariupol, potentially so that it would come just before the Chinese visit, so that there would be the mixed images of Putin in Mariupol and then Putin standing beside Xi, with the potential for that to give the implication of Chinese approval of what Putin was doing just days before. So I know your question is broader about how much of it will rub off on other politicians, but it's interesting that Xi should be the first one that the consideration even applies to. While I put that in the nest, Exit, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, just also notable that Ukraine is not a signatory to the ICC either. And I imagine that generally, like the US relationship to it being complicated, there's probably a number of countries that are rather complicated in their relationship to it, simply because the moment that you open up any sort of conflict, warranted or not, in other countries is the moment that you open yourself up for investigation. And that's not a place that a lot of people, like a lot of countries, want to put themselves. But I just wanted to note the Ukraine portion. But Jacoby is far more educated about this than I am.
That wasn't why I raised my hand. What I was thinking about was that you know, it's also complicated for Ukraine in the sense that if they're seeking support from Europe, that and perhaps to join Europe, that my sense is that they would need to become a signatory if they are not, as part of that process. So I would think, you know, this is just me supposing, but I would imagine that it would be in their interest to align themselves quickly for many different reasons with becoming a signatory there. But I think there's people here that are far more familiar with that than I even pretend to be, like Polaris and others.
Well, if maybe we can put it that if anybody here has Zelensky following them, then you should just DM him and get his opinion on whether they'll sign soon. So a few other aspects. For those listening, I normally aim to run the space about 3 hours, particularly for my co-hosts who have remained so dedicated. I just like to give some indication of timing. I'm hoping to kind of run through maybe 3 or 4 more little points on this topic. We'll see how much discussion there is around it. So we'll maybe run for another 15 minutes or so. And what that means is that some of the other discussion topics, like the coming influence of China, particularly in advance of Xi's visit, but then also the topic I keep kicking down the road around uranium politics and Russia. If you want to see more about those, do look at the sort of agenda resources thread that I have. If you scroll all the way to the back, the right side of the nest, you can see the link there. Maybe I'll try and put one up at the front of the nest so you don't have to scroll. But all the links are there. That way you'll be up to date because the Chinese visit will be happening in the next few days. But maybe I'll make that a priority as the first issue that we discuss on Thursday night. Oh, and FYI, our next conversation is going to be Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern or New York time. So we'll put the link up to that in a moment. Once the link is up, please do set your reminder. Jacoby, go ahead.
I accidentally put my hand up. So
happens to the best of us. It balances out for you correcting me on the ICC signatories and so on.
No, I was messing around in the nest. Sorry about that.
Okay. So messing around in the nest, doing my bidding. So the first item in the nest now is the agenda thread. So if you want to look at any of those resources that we don't speak to, they're there. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom of that, which I'm doing, you can maybe hear my mouse wheel going, is the invite to Thursday's space. And I'll put that up as a separate item in the nest, unless I'm beaten to it. So it should be there now. So additional points I wanted to get to. These are up in the nest. You'll find them. One is that Kevin Rothrock, who is the editor of Meduza, which is a Russian newspaper in exile, who I think does good coverage on many things, he made a tweet saying that, well, now when Putin travels, there's a risk that he'll be potentially arrested. And so it might not be crazy to imagine there being gun battles between his bodyguards and, you know, the authorities of countries they're visiting. I have no idea whether he was joking or not. But in any event, the national security account, Own All the Things, responded and said, well, pretty obviously not. The job of Putin's security detail will be in advance to determine that he is, you know, perfectly safe in visiting any foreign country, in that country's leadership would not arrest him. And that if they can't verify that, then Putin just will not travel. However, the next two tweets on that point are that one effect of being charged will be to isolate Putin within Russia and significantly narrow the number of places he can visit outside of it. Germany was one of the first countries that has come out and said, yes, we will arrest Putin. If he were to come to Germany, we'll respect this, the warrant essentially that's out on these charges. And then others have pointed out that Putin's real next major international visit is actually going to be to the BRICS summit that will be held in South Africa in August. And interestingly, I referred to case law that happened at the international level saying that executives do not have immunity. Interestingly, South Africa has had its own case law on the same matter that has come, their Supreme Court has come to the same conclusion, because it's often African leaders who have been facing war crimes charges. And so Africa in the past has refused to arrest people on International Criminal Court warrants. And their Supreme Court, having considered it, has said, no, you must arrest on these warrants. Now, whether the government follows through on that, we don't know. But this is where I try and sort of tangentially connect it to OSINT, in that not only is it background political context, but there is a little bit of tea leaf reading in terms of where may Putin travel, what are the odds of his being arrested, what things does he have on his schedule for travel that now have to be canceled because the risk is too great. Jacoby, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I wanted to also highlight, as part of your looking at the warrant and the legality of it in relation to Putin, but also in relation to the other person who is indicted, Maria Lvova-Belova, who is Russia's Commissioner for Children's Rights, who you had put up a thread on, and I'm not sure if I just put it up there, having just forgotten whether or not I did that or you did. But her story and her background is very interesting, and that she was singled out partly because he was charged with war crimes in relation to children removal, illegal removal, deportation of children. And that thread that you have in your agenda from Chris Owicki is very, very good. I commend that to people who are interested in learning more about her in particular. And I don't know if you had any commentary on her. I'd be interested.
I don't know very much about her beyond this one Chris O thread, which it was the idea that her personality, she may believe strongly in the things that she's doing, in terms of believing what's the phrase, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and she may believe that she's helping children and be delusional. But apparently she, even prior to taking on this role of coordinating the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, she had something like 22 or 23 children, being something like 3 of her biological children, several adopted children, and then like a huge number she had sort of taken in, I think, in sort of a foster care scenario. And while that kind of work is commendable, when you get up to numbers like 23 at the same time, it starts to be unusual. And the Chris's thread explains that the man that she had married had become a priest in the Russian Orthodox Church, and that apparently she has quite a lot of backing in her current work from the Russian Church, meaning that it may be more of a political statement than just a personal mission. Again, it's an interesting thread. I'd encourage you to read it. I would be inclined to go and read a little bit more about her independently, just to make sure that it's all accurate. We've been joined by a new speaker, Chauncey. I think I may have seen you speak once or twice before, but go ahead.
Yeah, you have. Ukraine's not signatory, but they have had two declarations. It's in 2013-14, and I think the second one was encompassed in a time period that would stretch up into now, so they would honor that.
Okay. I'll admit I'm not 100% sure on their status, but now it's something I have to go away and confirm. If you happen to have any background on that, whether it be even as something basic as a Wikipedia entry, that would be great. Thank you very much. Okay, I will just quickly glance at my thread to see if there were any more points I wanted to make in connection with the war crimes issue. So Germany said they would arrest him. His next visit is to South Africa. South Africa has a history of not arresting people on ICC warrants. So it, and given that Africa has appeared to be friendly to Russia of late, it's possible that he may be allowed to attend the BRICS summit and not be arrested, which would cause quite a bit of controversy and probably hurt the South African reputation. However, it's extremely unlikely Putin would travel anywhere without extremely strong assurances that he would not be arrested. And so that idea of gun battles breaking out is not something that's going to happen. The other thing in the context of Putin having been charged is the note that Russia is actually scheduled in the next week or two to become chair of the UN Security Council. And so Stephen was noting Timothy Snyder as a great author, speaker on Ukrainian issues. And so he's written two pieces here. One is on how ridiculous it is that they'll be the head of the Security Council. And then he has also been solicited by, I'm not sure whether it's the United States delegation or otherwise, to do a presentation to the United Nations on Russophobia, because I guess Russia has wanted to raise the allegation that much of the actions that have been taken against them are not for cause, but out of Russophobia. And so this is his presentation that is meant to debunk that. And I've put it up just because of the strange timing of them taking over head of the Security Council at the same time that Putin has been charged with war crimes, which is, of course, ridiculous. My last 2 points that I'll note, one is it's a comment by Garry Kasparov, right, the chess champion, who is also a strong opponent of the Kremlin. And he makes the point that there could be value in this charge in that, however it comes to happen, if Putin does go on trial, it may be very important to the future of Russia as a form of reconciliation measure, in that, having to be accounted for, having to have his actions accounted for on the international stage might require a lot of truths to come out in a way that will be hard for a successor regime to deny. And I think that's an important point I hadn't seen anyone else make. And then my last point on the war crimes charges is to put it in the context of the fact that Putin is facing re-election in Russia next year. And so what I've put up, the last item in the nest, is an article by Medusa that they got access to the election sort of PR strategy of Putin, saying that he had hoped to get a better election result than even the last time, where I think he won something like 78% of the vote. And it goes to how he's framing himself as standing, as guardian of Russia against the West, and that Russia has to become sort of a fortress Russia and isolated. And I'm wondering, this was put out before the charges were released, but I wonder whether the fact that he has been charged with war crimes more or less feeds directly into sort of his intended public relations image. Okay, well, having run through sort of these background nuances, we'll leave the items on Chinese influence and uranium matters for a future space. Oh, it occurs to me, I know Exit is here in the space. Exit, do we have a geolocation type puzzle for this week?
No, we don't. We
All right, then
are working on getting that all set up. Sorry about that.
No problem. We'll leave the audience wanting more then. Do we have any interaction for the audience who did the last geolocation puzzle, or was that all done in the comments to the last thread?
So it was all done in the comments. However, we can now publish and congratulations, Brad. I see you down there. You were a rock star on that. But I will publish a thread the answers to that so that others who are still working on it can go ahead and check their answers and sort out how they wanted to solve it. And I would recommend that if you have questions, if you're still working on it, then DM Brad and ask him how he solved it, because he's always really good at answering, or just add him in the comments. He's great at explaining his process there, and I bet he'd love to help you guys learn how to solve that particular postcard.
Just to help out those who aren't regulars to the space, because we get new people all the time, that's Brad Heitman, who's in the audience. That's his handle. There might be a couple of Brads. Go ahead.
I'll just grab the original tweet and I'll share it up in the nest, and then everybody will be able to see in the comments who the Brad is, and you can reply to him and ask him how he did it.
Perfect.
Check the DMs there, Mike. I sent that to you on the link to ICC.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chauncey. I may not have time to get it up in the nest for the crowd now, but I will add it to the replies below this space, because I do appreciate people looking up their sources. With regard to the geolocation puzzles, we are doing custom ones just so people can get a little bit of practice at using some tools, reverse image searching, translation software, and so on, in order to take an image and try and pin down its location. We put one up last week. We're hoping to do one consistently going forward. So if you're come to drop by and listen to the space and you enjoy that, try to stick around to the end. Otherwise, they will be put up in the replies under the space invite. So you can always come back and check them later if you want to try your hand at the puzzles. So on that note, I'll wrap up. I think we had a great discussion with Stephen today on his work with translating, in particular contributing to War Translated. We covered tons of material. If you're inspired by his story, I suspect that you can try your hand at some translation yourself, and then reach out to the team over there, and you may be able to contribute as well. I suspect that if you have any material that you think is particularly interesting that requires translation, you can always reach out to Stephen and see whether he might be able to assist. But of course, no promises on his behalf. We'll let him
just
speak for himself.
Just one thing about the reaching out. It would actually be really nice if some of you would send the material directly to me, because Dmitry can get a bit swamped at times. So your material might not get noticed, but I don't get that many DMs, so it's basically a guaranteed chance that I'll see it if you send it to me. Sorry for interrupting you, Mike.
No problem. Well, that's perfect. So if you have material you'd like to see translated, you think it would be useful for the community, send it to Stephen. And I would encourage you to follow Stephen, because that way it'll be easy for you to find him, both to see his new translations and also if you want to reach out. So thank you very much to all of our speakers tonight, and in particular to my co-hosts, including Jacoby, who stayed for the entire session, to Vinansky, and to Riverside Kitty. Without my co-hosts, it would be very hard to do what I do. So please do join us on Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll see you all there. Good night.